I stood over Katie's lifeless body in the intensive care unit and wondered whether or not this little girl could be saved. A few hours earlier, she had been found floating face down in a community swimming pool. No one knew how long she had been unconscious or exactly what had happened to cause her to lose consciousness. I didn't really expect to find out what had happened. The machines to which she was now hooked up to told a grim story. An emergency CAT scan showed massive swelling of the brain. She had no gag reflex. An artificial lung machine was breathing for her. In the blunt jargon of emergency room physicians, she was a train wreck. Looking back even now, I would guess she only had a 10% chance of surviving. I was the doctor who resuscitated her in the emergency room after the accident in the pool. I was serving my residency in pediatrics in a small town in Idaho and would be completing my residency a few months later in Seattle. I had previously been doing research on brain tumors, and at a national conference had presented a paper on the effects of chemotherapy on childhood leukemia. In between the world of academia studies and rat brain research, in which I tested the effects of various medicines on white rats, I wanted to sandwich in some practical medicine. Medicine probably doesn't get more practical than poor Katie's case. She was one of the sickest children I've ever cared for. Despite all of our best efforts, I was sure she was going to die. Still, we tried everything we could think of. 3 days later, she made a full recovery. Her case was one of those medical mysteries that demonstrate the power of the human organism to rebound. People sometimes cross the threshold of death only to return in full health. Why it happens is impossible to say, but it happened with Katie, whose neurological testing showed she had made a full recovery. When she was feeling well enough, I had her come in for a follow-up examination. One of the things I wanted to know was what she remembered about her near drowning. Had she been hit on the head? Had someone held her under the water? Had she blacked out or experienced a seizure? Without knowing exactly what had happened, there was a chance that she could have another blackout or seizure. I marveled at Katie when she came into the office. She was a pretty girl with long blonde hair and a shy, frightened manner. There was nothing abnormal in her walk or mannerisms. She was just another 9-year-old kid. Katie clearly remembered me. After introducing myself, she turned to her mother and said, "That's the one with the beard." First there was this tall doctor who didn't have a beard, and then he came in. Her statement was correct. The first into the emergency room was a tall, clean-shaven physician named Bill Longhurst. Katie remembered more. First, I was in the big room, and then they moved me to a smaller room where they did x-rays on me. She accurately noted such details as having a tube down my nose, which was her description of nasal intubation. Most physicians intubate orally, and that is the most common way it is represented on television. I remember being amazed at the events she recollected. Even though her eyes had been closed and she was profoundly comatose during the entire experience, she still saw what was going on. I asked her an open-ended question. "What do you remember about being in the swimming pool?" "Do you mean when I visited the Heavenly Father?" she replied. Whoa, I thought. That's a good place to start. Tell me about meeting the Heavenly Father. "I met Jesus and the Heavenly Father," she said. Maybe it was the shocked look on my face, or maybe it was shyness, but that was it for the day. She became very embarrassed and would speak no more. What she told me during our next meeting changed my life. She remembered nothing about the drowning itself. Her first memory was of darkness, and the feeling that she was so heavy she couldn't move. Then a tunnel opened, and through that tunnel came Elizabeth. Elizabeth was tall and nice with bright golden hair. She accompanied Katie up the tunnel, where she saw her late grandfather and met several other people. Among her new friends were 2 young boys, souls waiting to be born, named Mark and Andy, who played with her and introduced her to many people. Finally, Elizabeth, who seemed to be a guardian angel to Katie, took her to meet the Heavenly Father and Jesus. The Heavenly Father asked her if she wanted to go home. Katie cried. She said she wanted to stay with him. Then Jesus asked her if she wanted to see her mother again. Yes, she replied, and then she awoke. It took her almost an hour to tell this story. She was extremely shy, but told the tale in such a powerful and compelling way that I believed her implicitly. Clearly, this had been a fun event for a child so young. She didn't yet have a concept of religious or mystical experiences. She was aware that something had happened to her that she didn't quite understand. I didn't understand it either. I began to investigate. First, I went to the nurses in the intensive care unit, who told me that the first words out of Katie's mouth when she awoke were, "Where are Mark and Andy?" She asked for them repeatedly throughout her convalescence. Then I probed her family's religious beliefs. I wanted to see if she had been heavily indoctrinated with a belief in guardian angels and tunnels to heaven. The answer from her mother was an emphatic no. She was a middle-of-the-road Mormon. She believed in the afterlife and attended Sunday school regularly, but no one in the family espoused a belief in spirit guides or tunnels to heaven. These things simply never came up in the family's religious teachings. No one in the family had mentioned anything that would trigger the images that came to Katie at the brink of death. My curiosity grew. I spent hours talking with her parents, trying to discover any factors in her upbringing that could have influenced her experience. I couldn't find any. My deepest instinct told me that nothing in Katie's experience was taught to her before the near drowning. Her experience was fresh, not a recalled memory. I began looking through the medical literature. My search revealed little besides a name for what had happened to Katie. It was called the near-death experience. The name for this phenomena was coined by Dr. Raymond Moody in his 1975 book, Life After Life. Near-death experience, or NDE, is used to describe a mystical experience that happens to people who almost die. A poll conducted by the George Gallup Organization found in an extensive survey an estimated 8 million near-death experiences in 1982. Needless to say, these are very controversial events. Some say that NDEs are just dramas created by the mind in a state of panic. Others say that they are glimpses into the next world. What we now know as the near-death experience has been reported since the beginning of recorded history. In the New Testament, Paul describes one that he had, and Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century collected these experiences as proof of life beyond. Karol Zaleski, a prominent Harvard theologian, finds near-death experiences in Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and Near Eastern myths and legends. It wasn't until 1975, when Dr. Moody published his findings, that anyone realized there was a pattern to the experiences. Something mystical and unearthly happened to many people who had almost died. According to Moody, a full-blown near-death experience happens something like this. A person, say, has a heart attack in his living room. The chest pain is excruciating, and he passes out. What seems like moments later, he awakens to find himself floating above his body, where he watches the paramedics administering CPR. He tries to stop them, but it becomes obvious that they can't hear him. Suddenly, a tunnel appears to this disembodied spirit. He finds himself zooming up it with the whooshing sound of speed in his ears. His trip ends in a garden of rich green plants, one that is glowing with unearthly light. He looks at his own hands and realizes he, too, is composed of light. People approach him. They are glowing, too. Some of them look familiar. There's Uncle George, who died 20 years ago, and Aunt Mabel. Even Grandfather is here in radiant glory. All of them are happy to see this visitor, feelings that they are able to express non-verbally with their warmth. These glowing personages pale in comparison to what comes next. A master being of light appears. Some call him God, others Allah, and others the man. Whoever he is so bright and loving that the visitor feels drawn to him. With more love and caring than this visitor had ever felt from anyone on earth, the master being of light engulfs him with his presence, taking him on a three-dimensional review of his life. Not only does he see everything he has done to anybody, but he feels everything as well. In addition to experiencing the way he felt when it happened, the visitor knows how it felt to the other person. This sensory barrage is accompanied by a moral commentary from the being of light, who compassionately communicates to the person what he did right and wrong, and indicates things he might do in the future. The problem is that the person wants this experience to go on forever. He doesn't want to leave the being of light's bosom. He tells this to the being, but is given no choice. He must return. Suddenly, he feels himself sucked back into his own body, where he becomes a changed person. The type A behavior that made him an edgy, angry workaholic is now gone. Replacing these traits is a thirst for knowledge, feelings, and expressions of love that astonishes the people who know him. In medical school, Dr. Moody was able to find more people with remarkably similar accounts of their experiences. It soon became clear to him that near-death experiences were much more common than he had expected. In any group of 30, says Moody, I can find someone who has had one or knows someone who has had one. After my experience with Katie, I decided to do something no other medical doctor had done. I published a description of Katie's NDE in a medical journal. To my knowledge, this was the first description of a near-death experience in a child. I wanted other pediatricians to know that children had such experiences. I felt challenged by Dr. Moody's bold assertions, especially his claim that these experiences were universal to all human beings. Many questions began to pop into my mind. Do children have near-death experiences that are different from those of adults? Does one need to be near death to have an NDE? Is there a part of the brain that produces near-death experiences? Have the previous researchers missed any traits? Is there anything else that happens during a near-death experience that the researchers didn't discover? How did NDEs affect children after they became adults? No research existed to answer these questions. In treating Katie, I discovered a significant gap in the medical literature. I also discovered another, more disturbing gap. Although death and dying are now the province of the physician, most aren't comfortable with the subject. They regard death as a sign of personal failure, final confirmation of the limitations of medicine. Katie's experience was greeted with some skepticism and doubt by my colleagues. Most of the doctors I talked to thought her experience was a freak hallucination that I embellished. Some of my friends implied that I was probably hallucinating as well, and took to whistling the theme to the Twilight Zone whenever I would bring up the subject. The physicians' attitudes on near-death experiences must have been apparent to their patients. Although I spoke to psychiatrists and psychologists about Katie's NDE, few of them had ever heard of an experience being described by a patient. Even the head of psychiatry was skeptical. He had a nationwide reputation from his work on death and dying. He helped me to search the literature and to structure studies I was considering. But still, he was doubtful. The nursing staff had a different response. They told of many similar experiences occurring among their patients. Perhaps the difference was in how they treated their patients. Where the doctors were generally brusque and hurried, the nurses spent more time talking and listening. All of this made me more curious. Maybe I was driven by Katie's deep sincerity when she told of the miraculous journey she had taken. Maybe the driving factor was Raymond Moody's bold assertion that if someone were to conduct a scientific study, it would confirm his findings that NDEs do exist. Most of all, I wanted to know what had happened to Katie. Several months after Katie's marvelous experience, I left Pocatello and went to Children's Hospital in Seattle. I wanted to research the causes and the meaning of the near-death experience. In my off hours, I designed a scientific study that would answer the most basic question. Does a person need to be near death to have a near-death experience? This may seem like an odd question, but it was the one that no one had really answered. I began by organizing a research team, and together we assembled two groups of children. The control group consisted of 121 children who were critically ill, but not near death. These children were on artificial lung machines, were treated with tranquilizers and narcotics, and ranged in age from 3 to 16 years. They were all hospitalized in the intensive care unit at Children's Hospital. Although the children never had life-threatening episodes, they were quite ill. For example, one girl had been completely paralyzed for 3 months. She was at no time near the point of death, but she would certainly have had reason to hallucinate. Another girl had a peculiar problem in which her blood pressure would suddenly plummet, causing her to lose consciousness. Other children in the control group experienced a horrifying disease known as epiglottitis, in which the cartilage protecting the windpipe suddenly swells and prevents breathing. All of them had been bedridden for a long period of time, and most had been heavily medicated at one time or another. They had experienced the effects of narcotic drugs, the same drugs that some doctors thought had created Katie's visions. The study group, on the other hand, was composed of children who had looked death in the face. Kids who would probably have died or faced severe handicaps were it not for modern medical care. These 12 children represented quite a collection of diseases. All of them had cardiac arrests, stemming from such accidents as near drownings and automobile wrecks, and such diseases as severe kidney problems, asthma, and heart stoppages during surgery. My study design was quite simple. I identified myself as being a physician who was interested in the psychological experience of being in an intensive care unit. I was careful to avoid any mention of near-death research, since I didn't want to influence their responses in any way. I simply said that I wanted to learn what it was like to be very sick, and I hoped they would share the experience with me, no matter how strange it might be. The average interview lasted about 2 hours. The questions were carefully structured to be open-ended, so the children wouldn't be coached in any way. When these questions were answered, I then asked 26 questions from our near-death experience questionnaire. These questions deal with the specific characteristics of the near-death experience and enabled the responses of the children to be checked against the traits of NDEs. After hundreds of hours of research and questioning, I had my answer. A person does need to be near death to experience an NDE. Of the 121 seriously ill children, not one of them had anything resembling a near-death experience. A few had vivid dreams, the type you would expect them to have. One child had the understandable dream of monsters dressed in white coats attacking her. Another remembered nurses asking for medication or gloves. Of the 121 control patients, 118 had no memory at all of their hospital stay, in spite of having survived frightening illnesses and of having passed through that life-saving torture chamber known as the intensive care unit. I went outside the control group to interview 37 more children who had been treated with almost every kind of mind-altering medication known to pharmacology. These children had been given anesthetic agents, narcotics, Valium, Thorazine, Haldol, Dilantin, antidepressants, mood elevators, and painkillers. My aim was to see if drugs caused the NDEs and to find out if those skeptical doctors who doubted Katie's experience were right. None of them had anything resembling an NDE. The experimental group, those children who had survived cardiac arrest or who had miraculously returned from deep comas, had another story altogether. Most of these children had at least one of the NDE traits: being out of their physical bodies, traveling up some sort of tunnel, seeing a light, visiting with people who describe themselves as being dead, seeing a being of light, having a life review, and maybe even deciding consciously to return to their bodies. Usually, they would begin to describe their NDE with a look of puzzlement, and a statement similar to that of one patient who said, "Well, I kind of remember a really funny thing that I can't exactly tell you. I was looking at myself and floating. It was dark, and at the same time it was light. I was going somewhere, but I didn't know exactly where." With further prompting, they would tell their story. Some would offer fragmentary images of a powerful experience. Others would come forth with wonderful and compelling stories, much like the one from Katie. Usually, they had not told their parents about their NDE, and none had told any doctor or nurse about it. Before I continue, let me introduce you to Dina, although that is not her real name. Dina had a near-death experience when she was 8 years old. She nearly died from a diabetic coma. Tell me, Dina, can you describe what you experienced?
I started feeling really sick. I started losing my sight and getting numb and weak, and I couldn't move. So my mom took me to the hospital, and the next thing I knew, I was in a coma. It felt like I was dreaming, actually. It was in 3 segments. The first one was that I was lying on this examining table with doctors and nurses around me. So I started floating up to the ceiling, and I was watching myself on the table. But I couldn't see the doctors and nurses after that. I just could see my body laying there dead. And how I came out of it was I was lying in a hospital bed with doctors around me and this machine with a red light and a green light. And they kept trying to persuade me to push a button. And I kept saying, no, I'm scared. Then I pushed the opposite button and I collapsed. And then I came out of the coma. And then there was this third segment, and I was lying in a hospital bed, and I was 10 in the 4th grade when this happened. And my 4th grade class and my teacher was standing around me in a circle. And I came out of it 2 days later. I'm not scared of death at all. It's a pleasant thing, and knowing that I was going to die, it wouldn't bother me. I'm not scared of anything now. If someone had a gun to my head, of course I'd be scared, but knowing the fact that maybe I'm going to die, in 5 years or a year, it wouldn't bother me. Knowing that, it's a positive thing, basically.
All of the children were puzzled by what had occurred. They knew something special had happened, but their youth made them unsure of just what it was. For some, the experience meant nothing. It happened and that was that. For others, it led to profound changes. Some of these children feel they were brought back for a purpose. Some are more mature than their friends, or now are better students. None of these children were adversely affected by the experience. In fact, they all seemed to be somewhat better off. Let me give you some examples. An 11-year-old boy had been having blackout spells for several months. Finally, his parents brought him to Children's Hospital for an evaluation. While waiting in the lobby, he had another blackout followed by a cardiac arrest. Chaos erupted. Doctors rushed to the lobby and started mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and heart massage. He was then put on a gurney and rushed to the intensive care unit, where emergency procedures were begun to restart his heart. He was without a heartbeat for at least 20 minutes. During this time, several cardiac medications were given, with no success. One of the nurses present remembers saying, "I wish we didn't have to do this." meaning that she thought the life-saving attempts were useless. As a last resort, the physicians tried the cardioversion paddles again. They pressed the devices against his chest and pushed the buttons that sent electrical current jolting through his heart. Miraculously, the boy opened his eyes and said, "That was weird. You just sucked me back into my body." He then lapsed back into unconsciousness. The boy was taken to an operating room for emergency surgery. He had a condition called sick sinus syndrome, in which the area of the heart that regulates the beating, the sinus node, stops working. An electrical pacemaker was implanted. I spoke to the boy 7 years later. He was in high school and worked at a part-time job. He had made a complete recovery from his cardiac arrest. At first, he was very vague about this frightening experience. He didn't remember opening his eyes and speaking to the doctors and nurses after being brought back to life. He described the pain of the electric shock as a pain I will never forget. I still have nightmares about the time they put those paddles on my body. Although his parents said that he didn't remember anything about that initial experience in the hospital waiting room, I sensed that this young man was somewhat troubled by his experience. I probed further, asking him for more details about that day, and specifically about any dreams he might have had. Finally, he looked me right in the eyes and said, "Well, if you promise not to laugh, I'll tell you what happened." I remember it as if it were yesterday. I remember going to the hospital that day. My parents had gone into the admitting office when suddenly I heard a whooshing sound in my ears. I felt like you feel when you go over a bump in a car going real fast, and you feel your stomach drop out. I heard a buzzing sound in my ears. The next thing I knew, I was in a room, crouched in a corner of the ceiling. I could see my body below me. It was real dark, you know. I could see my body because it was lit up with a light, like there was a light bulb inside me. I could see the nurses and doctors working on me. My doctor was there, and so was Sandy, one of the nurses. I heard Sandy say, "I wish we didn't have to do this." I wondered what they were doing. I saw a doctor put jelly on my chest. My hair was really messed up. It seemed greasy, and I wished that I had washed my hair before coming to the hospital. They had cut my clothes off, but my pants were still on. I heard a doctor say, "Stand back," and then he pushed a button on one of the paddles. Suddenly, I was back inside my body. 1 minute, I was looking down at my face. I could see the tops of the doctors' heads. After he pushed that button, I was suddenly looking into a doctor's face. Man, that hurt. It hurts just thinking about it. I still have dreams about how much it hurt. Sometimes I wake up at night screaming from that pain. No, I've never heard of a near-death experience. I don't watch TV much. If I read mostly comic books. No, I didn't tell my parents about it. I don't know why not. I guess I just didn't feel like talking about it. I have never heard of anybody having this happen to them. I would not tell my friends about it. They would probably think I was crazy. This young man had an out-of-body experience, one of the symptoms of the core experience. Typical of this, he saw his body illuminated by a white light, while everything else seemed to be in darkness. The experience transformed him, another result of the core experience. It is my observation that he now feels he has a purpose in life. He is not overly interested in material things as so many of his friends are. He is more interested in acquiring knowledge than money. As he put it, "I don't feel like partying and drinking as much as my friends do, or doing a lot of stupid stuff. I know that there is a better reason for living." Recent research indicates that learning and memory begins much earlier than previously thought. In one research project, 7-month-olds watched a videotape showing them how to fit a toy together. The researchers then gave those pieces to the children, who were able to assemble the toy as a result of what they had learned from the video. In the control group, children were given the pieces without first seeing the video and were unable to fit the toy together. My study was published in 1986 in the American Journal of Diseases of Children. It proved, as no other study before, that a person must be on the brink of death to have the symptoms of a near-death experience. My findings eliminated the theory that NDEs are the result of drugs or sleep deprivation, or that they were merely bad dreams or the subconscious awareness of surgery. Think about it. Of the 121 patients we interviewed who had survived a serious illness but were not near death, 118 had no experience at all. The remaining 3 had dreams of white-coated monsters and the like. Meanwhile, 8 of the 12 survivors of heart attacks had visions of leaving their bodies and traveling to other realms. That is almost 70%, a percentage so high it eliminates the element of chance or statistical error. In addition, I did not permit anyone to volunteer for the study. Instead, I interviewed over a 10-year period all survivors of cardiac arrest. Doing that prevented children from entering the study who might have made up a story just to be included. I also thoroughly reviewed the medical records of all patients I studied, carefully documenting the drugs they were on, the anesthesia used, the amount of oxygen in their blood, and the results of various laboratory tests. I carefully matched my control patients and those in the study group to make sure they were the same age. I also made sure that both groups were intubated or attached to an artificial lung machine. The reason for this matching was to see if near-death experiences are hallucinations caused by drugs or a lack of oxygen in the blood, as many physicians believe. The answer is that they are not. Many of the patients who had full-blown near-death experiences were not being treated with hallucinogenic medications at all. The control group had nothing resembling near-death experiences, despite being treated with such drugs as morphine, Valium, Thorazine, anesthetic agents, Dilantin, phenobarbital, and codeine. To make sure I wasn't missing anything, I had a team of medical students comb the psychological and medical literature in search of drugs or psychological states that caused hallucinations similar to NDEs. Ketamine and LSD came the closest, but neither of these drugs is used in normal patient care, nor were they used on either my control or study group. Most researchers are faced with the problem of publish or perish. In my case, I published and perished. 3 articles on the Seattle study were published in the American Medical Association's prestigious pediatric journal. I emphasized in my conclusion that these experiences are probably a natural part of the dying process, and as such are worthy of study. I made the point that people die in hospitals, and therefore the dying process should be examined in hospitals. Unfortunately, the hospital's Human Subject Review Committee didn't agree with me. The committee said that such a study would be too intrusive on patients' rights. By making them relive these traumatic events, I was causing unnecessary suffering. I pointed out that the opposite had been true. The patients actually appreciated a doctor showing interest in their experience. And besides, participation was voluntary. Subjects were told they didn't have to talk unless they wanted to. The answer from the committee to do further studies was no. I couldn't even get permission to informally study these patients. I felt that intruding on patients' rights had nothing to do with the decision. The real reason, I feel, is that doctors don't like to research death. Although most people die in hospitals, the subject of death is almost taboo there. I remember the head of my research program asking me why I was researching near-death experiences. I told him that although much was known about infant colic and toilet training, relatively little was known about the dying process. I simply wanted to know what happened at the point of death. When I said that, he shook his head. But what are you really trying to do? Just what was I trying to do? Trying to comprehend what happens beyond the Great Divide? Hoping to help patients cope with a rapidly approaching death? Both these things, actually. The medical establishment wears mental blinders when it comes to the subject of death. In some respects, it should be that way. After all, a patient expects life from his physician. He expects healing for his sickness, comfort for his ailments. But doctors should be able to answer questions about death, just as we can about other aspects of normal development and life stages. In many ways, the physician is as poorly equipped to handle failure as is the patient. For instance, it is well documented that as patients get closer to death, their doctors spend less time at their bedsides. In 5 years of residency training, I had only one lecture on death and dying that explained how to deal with the emotions and stresses that working with dying patients may generate. Most of us are just out of medical school when we face the all too frequent failures of medicine. The lesson that medicine is great, but not that great, is a hard one for a doctor to learn. I learned my first and harshest lesson about death after serving as an intern for only 3 days. I was working in the infant intensive care unit when one of the patients died. The weeping parents took their baby into a small room to be alone with him in their grief. The baby hadn't died suddenly. Another intern and I had spent 3 hours trying to save him. We had started resuscitation at the end of a 36-hour shift and were exhausted when it was finally all over. It was my first hands-on cardiac arrest, and it didn't seem real to me. Though absolutely worn out, we were filled with the excitement and adrenaline that such an intense experience can generate. In our exhaustion, we made the ghoulish jokes that callow interns sometimes make. We laughed and spoke loudly about what a great case this had been. In the midst of this shamefully boisterous conversation, the parents came out of the room. The shame hit me so hard, I almost lost my breath. The nurses covered their mouths and walked away slowly. The other intern and I were left alone in the hallway to face the parents. The heavy weight of shame that I felt prevented me from looking the sad couple in the eyes. Gently they took our hands and thanked us for what we had done to save their son. The mother then spoke to one of the nurses. "We heard your laughter, and at first we were angry. We were shocked that you would be laughing at a time like this. Then we suddenly found ourselves enjoying the sound of your laughter. We knew that we had suffered the loss of our son, but that life and joy still existed in the world. Thank you for your laughter, and thank you for trying to save our son." To avoid thinking about death, I turned to the technical skills of medicine, taking my joy from placing tubes in patients and reading machines. I never questioned the need to resuscitate a patient. Most of us believed in doing everything medically possible to save patients. Our job was to follow the motto, "Every patient deserves the absolute best care possible." I never questioned that the best care meant aggressive intervention at the point of death to revive the patient. I still don't question that credo. The physician's dilemma is where to draw the line. The cold reception the Seattle study received from some of my colleagues did little to stifle my interest. I continued to collect stories of patients' near-death experiences from other doctors who knew of my interest and were curious themselves. Hardly a week went by without a doctor or nurse telling me a puzzling story about a patient having a detailed out-of-body experience, or about someone being revived from near death, only to tell of a world of light and beauty on the other side. I listened, took notes, and then interviewed the patient to verify the details. A fascinating category of experiences began to emerge from these referrals, something other researchers have called pre-death visions. Carlos Osis and Erlander Haraldson, two psychologists who collected many case studies of visions at the hour of death, have done some of the most extensive work in this field. They have found that these pre-death visions have many things in common with near-death experiences. For instance, the dying patient who has been in pain for several days suddenly finds himself devoid of pain and discomfort, a trait similar to people having near-death experiences. Also, pre-death visions frequently involve visions of other worlds and conversations with dead loved ones. For thousands of years, pre-death visions were accepted as part of the dying process. Before death became the domain of the hospital, these visions were common and expected. French historian Philip Aries has documented that before 1000 AD, people had entirely different death experiences than the ones we have today. When the dying person felt his time was near, he usually reviewed his life, his achievements and failures, and wept for the sorrow he felt in knowing he wouldn't see family or friends again. The dying person then asked forgiveness of friends and family for any trespasses he might have committed in the life he was about to leave. Usually, says Aries, the dying would tell of visions of God and of seeing those who had died before them. How different dying is today. Patients who have pre-death visions are treated for anxiety with narcotics and Valium, both of which erase short-term memory and prevent patients from remembering any visions or near-death experiences they may have had. These visions are a forgotten aspect of life's mysterious processes. Far from needing to be treated with narcotics or Valium, pre-death visions can reduce pain for the patient and the family. James was an 11-year-old patient who was dying of lymphoma. In his last days, he was hospitalized with severe, untreatable pneumonia. Though he was having difficulty breathing and was in constant pain, he was given very few drugs such as morphine or Valium because they make breathing more difficult. 3 days before James died, a circle of loved ones gathered around his bed. They were startled when James suddenly sat upright and announced that Jesus was in the room. He then asked for everyone to pray for him. At about 3 a.m., James sat up again, startling the 4 people who had gathered around him to pray. "There are beautiful colors in the sky," he shouted. "There are beautiful colors and more colors. You can double jump up here. Double jump." By dawn, it seemed that life was almost over for James. His breathing was labored, and his heart was pounding like that of a marathon runner's. Even then, little James had more to communicate. Opening his eyes wide, he asked his grieving parents to let me go. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I've seen God, angels and shepherds. I see the white horse." As sick as he was, James still begged his family not to feel sorry for him. He had seen where he was going, and it was a joyous and wondrous place. "It's wonderful. It's beautiful," he said, his hand held out in front of him. Soon he laid back and fell asleep. James never regained consciousness and died 2 days later. Paranormal occurrences aside, James' beautiful visions consoled his family. By reassuring his parents that he was going to a joyous and wondrous place with God, James brought his family closer together. Instead of suffering the shattering loss that so many families experience when they lose a child, James' family left the hospital knowing they had done everything they could to save their son. They also firmly believed he was safely at rest in God's hands. I am not presenting these pre-death visions as a way of saying that medications should be withheld from dying patients. Nor am I criticizing doctors who want to prolong life, even when things seem hopeless. But there comes a time when the doctor must close his black bag, take the stethoscope out of his ears, and listen to his patient. Here's a story that involves an event I didn't witness. It was told to me by a physician in Utah. A 5-year-old boy was in a coma, dying from a malignant brain tumor. He had been in the coma for 3 weeks and was surrounded almost the entire time by his family. They encircled his bed and prayed constantly for his recovery, taking only a few brief breaks to eat and rest. At the end of the 3rd week, the pastor of the family's church came into the hospital room and told them a remarkable story. He'd had a dream, he said, in which the boy told him, "It's my time to die. You must tell my parents to quit praying. I'm supposed to go now." The pastor was nervous about delivering this message to the family. Still, he said, it was a message too vivid to ignore. It was as though he was right there in the room talking to me face to face. The family members accepted the minister's dream as a message from their son. They prayed, they touched his comatose body, and they told him that he would be missed, but he had permission to die. Suddenly the boy regained consciousness. He thanked his family for letting him go, and told them that he would be dying soon. He died the next day. Perhaps the most important aspect of this story is its cathartic nature. This family was allowed to assuage its grief because they knew that their son was ready to die. Just what was I trying to do with my Seattle study? I was just trying to listen. My study wasn't an attempt to prove life after death. It wasn't an attempt to prove reincarnation. It was simply a means of listening to patients and learning from them. I have found that parents and doctors alike feel responsible for the death of a child. The parents wonder if the illness is something genetic, or perhaps the result of their lifestyle. The physician is concerned that he may not have used the right dose of medication at the right time, as though there always is a right dose of medicine. Before I continue, I would like you to meet Henry and hear about his near-death experience.
I was in the hospital, and I was having problems with my heart from a high fever, and my heart basically came to a stop. I flatlined for about 30 seconds, and during that time I was looking down at the doctor from the back. I could see him and the nurse, and then I saw them bring the paddles on me. As soon as they hit the paddles on me, I was looking back up at them, and first thing I said was, "You just sucked me back into my body." I was 11 years old. I remember when I was up on the ceiling, I was relaxed. I couldn't feel anything. I could still hear some voices. I assumed they were the doctor and the nurse. I could see people running around, trying to get me back revived. And when they revived me, it was quick, and I was right back in my body and looking up at the doctor. When I was up on the ceiling, I just felt really relaxed. It's made my outlook a little different. It's made me feel that your life is an ongoing thing, and you have to live life to the fullest and get as much out of it as you can. I'm just living my life the way I want, so that when I do die, I know that I'll go somewhere. I'm not afraid of dying. I know that when I die, I'll go somewhere else.
To research near-death experiences today is to be lumped together with spiritualists, TV ministers, and UFO believers. Medical science ignores the dying process and the fact that it involves presentiments of death and visions. Modern science has developed new medical techniques, but not new rituals to help us deal with the lingering type of death it brings. Death has now become dirty, a failure, and medicalized. Research has shown death to be a taboo topic in many hospital situations. There are many subtle ways that doctors, nurses, parents, and even the children themselves create a world of pretense and concealment of the actual diagnosis. Sociologists have even formulated the unwritten rules that physicians, nurses, and dying patients and their parents adhere to in their interactions. Here are a few common rules. All parties avoid dangerous topics. These topics include the child's physical appearance, future events and holidays, future plans outside the hospital, or even what medications the child is being given. Discussions of dangerous topics stop immediately if someone becomes emotional. When something happens to expose the fiction that is being sustained, then everybody pretends that nothing went awry. All parties strive to keep interactions normal. As death approached, researchers have found a dramatic increase in the discussion of such safe topics as ward activities, restaurants, movies, television programs, and so forth. All parties strive to keep interactions brief. When reality intrudes, all parties strive to end the interaction. If we doctors and nurses can't discuss holidays with dying patients because they may not be alive for the next holiday, and we can't even discuss medications they are taking, how can we feel comfortable discussing pre-death visions? Most of us aren't. Yet these visions potentially may give the patient a sense of control and may alleviate the terrible anxiety, fear, depression, and anger that a child's death can generate in those who take care of him. Our current attitudes towards death started developing in the mid-1800s, when physicians began lying to patients about their true prognosis. I call this the loving lie. Rather than tell a patient that death was imminent and that they should get their affairs in order, physicians instead told the patient that they would soon recover, or that a new medical treatment would be started. As recently as 10 years ago, most physicians felt that such lying was ethical and in the patient's best interest. Since the loving lie can only be maintained if the patient is kept ignorant, physicians became less willing to answer questions. Patients ask fewer questions too. The patient and the physician thus enter into a mutual pact not to discuss death. Children especially avoid discussing death because they recognize that people visit them less if they ask questions. Earlier in human history, presentiments of death were widely known, discussed, and even expected. Near-death experiences were not considered paranormal or supernatural. I think they should be treated that way again. They are natural signs of death. Science has not disproven the validity of these visions. Rather, it has simply ignored them. The near-death experiences of children remind us of forgotten ancient truths. This wisdom from the mouths of babes can teach us new and healthier ways of understanding our own deaths. Virtually all primitive societies believed in survival after death. In fact, it has only been in the last 200 years, and then primarily in Western civilization, that the belief in a hereafter has been abandoned as unscientific. Science is our religion now. Genetic engineering and heart transplants have become our hope of eternal life. Life after death is seen as a subject that is unworthy of scientific investigation. When science turns its spotlight on life after death, it is usually trying to debunk it. How is it that we have forgotten the knowledge of the ancients? What has transpired so that these cosmic truths, taken for granted by our ancestors, are now largely forgotten or ridiculed? How is it that so many physicians have stopped observing and listening? Only 20 years ago, it came as a complete surprise to the medical profession that dying people actually went through a variety of psychological stages before passing on. In her book on death and dying, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross documented 5 stages of dying: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and ultimately acceptance. Yet this hotly debated information has long been common knowledge to most nurses, who attend patients and talk to them instead of at them. The medical establishment has managed to make near-death experiences a freakish event, not the rule. It has convinced patients that they are having bad dreams, not profound experiences that bond them with all of humanity. What has changed in Western society that has led to this massive denial of death? By the time our children reach adulthood, they have seen over 1,000 violent deaths on television, yet they have no concept of what is involved in the dying process. How have we gotten ourselves in this situation? Some theologians feel that the change in Western spirituality started in the 17th and 18th centuries, with scientist philosophers Isaac Newton, John Locke, and John Ray. These three English Protestants and amateur theologians built the foundations of modern science by trying to discover the works of God in the design of the universe. Hence, when the apple bopped Newton on the head, it led to the theory of gravity, the way in which God worked to keep everything on the earth, according to Newton. Their work, which led to the scientific revolution, was initially an attempt to find the hidden divinity of God within nature. By uncovering the natural laws that controlled the universe, this trio of geniuses believed that we could better understand God. The triumph of science in interpreting the world weakened the role of the church. By the late 1800s, many people no longer believed in heaven and hell. Church attendance dropped dramatically as the Industrial Revolution rapidly vindicated science as the new God. As quickly as science has advanced toward unlocking nature's secrets, we have moved away from spirituality and the possibility of a life beyond. After all, it is an intangible subject as far as science is concerned. Is there a way to conduct an experiment proving the afterlife that yields reproducible results? No. Is there anything for a scientist other than anecdotal or scriptural evidence? Not so far. With the explosion of scientific knowledge, we have seen a brutal revolution in traditional ideas and feelings. Less than 100 years ago, most people died at home, surrounded by a multi-generational family and loved ones. Today, most people die alone in hospitals. Today, fewer than 1/2 of American households are composed of two biological parents and children. Fewer still include grandparents. The growth of medical technology and the loss of religious involvement in the healing or dying process has greatly changed our attitudes about death. The focus is on the living and the losses they will incur. It is widely assumed that those who are near death are beyond knowing. Deathbed rituals have been abandoned. Pre-death visions have been forgotten or discarded as hallucinations. The loving lie shields everyone against the inevitable. Medical science, with its ability to use machines in place of failed organs, has replaced religion as the key to immortality. The attitude of society towards death has changed. Today, we ignore death. I think it is time to change the way we deal with critically ill patients. For instance, intensive care units should be designed so that visitors will be welcome, but won't be in the way. It is also important to talk positively and frequently to the comatose or dying patients, since we now know that they may be much more aware of things around them than we realize. Indeed, they may even be hovering above us as we administer to them. Make the patient's spiritual needs a routine part of daily rounds. Just as much a part of his medical chart as a detailed description of urine output. It isn't important for the medical establishment to accept near-death experiences as proof of a life beyond this one. It is important that they not dismiss them as deathbed fantasies or categorize them as bad dreams. They are real according to the person who has them, and should be used accordingly as a healing tool. These experiences can be used to inspire faith. As the great physician Sir William Osler said, "Nothing in life is more wonderful than faith, the one great moving force which we can never weigh in the balance or test in the laboratory." Story after story, puzzle after puzzle, case studies like this one come along. Do these mysterious tales prove the existence of a higher plane? Do they prove the existence of the soul? A part of us that leaves the body, flies up that tunnel, and, well, goes to heaven? Science has long debunked the spirit because of its intangibility. For the past 100 years, neuroscience has concentrated on exploring the intricate connections between brain and body that allow us to walk, breathe, and use our senses. Most neurologists are not interested in studying consciousness. Denying the existence of the soul, scientists define the brain as limited to neuron and electrochemical reactions that cause observable behavior. To admit more would be to confess that there is more to the human mind than simply the brain. The soul has been widely defined throughout history. Some societies have believed that the soul represents the highest of human thought, and therefore it is most abstract and difficult to define. Others have believed that the soul represents the source of life itself, while others have considered the soul only to be the source of afterlife. Democritus, a 5th century Greek philosopher, felt that life was sustained by psychic atoms that were spread throughout the body but were controlled by the brain, which contained the bonds of the soul. Plato theorized that the soul had 3 parts: intellectual, irascible, and sexual, but only the first aspect had the virtue of immortality. Galen, the 1st century Greek physician, agreed with Plato but went further. He divided the soul into several functions. All of our motor and sensory abilities were attributed to the soul, as were rational functions such as imagination, reason, and memory. It was the French philosopher René Descartes who offered the viewpoint that is dominant in the Western world today. He felt that the body was a machine composed of bones, blood, muscles, nerves, and skin, and was controlled by the brain. The soul, according to Descartes, was something only found in human beings and not in animals. It couldn't be divided into parts the way Plato said it could. It was unique, immaterial, and immortal. This theory was called dualism. Many accepted the dualism of Descartes then, and many still accept it today. Many accept only half of the dualistic argument, the half that says the body is a machine. Scientists who fit into that category are known as behavioralists. Researchers who believe that all human and animal functions can be explained by observable behaviors. For the most part, they see man as nothing more than a complex animal or machine. The invention of the computer further seemed to vindicate the behavioral approach. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, most brain scientists considered philosophy to be silly and unrelated to the real work of discovering the circuitry of the brain. To a great extent, this type of thinking persists today. Richard Restock, the acclaimed neurologist who wrote a book entitled The Brain, states that there is no seat of the mind, and that the entire concept of mind or soul is a philosophical fallacy, nothing more than a literary device. I must hasten to add that many researchers in the medical profession feel deep down in their heart that there is a soul. I remember one of my professors at Johns Hopkins University telling me, "When I say I went for a walk today, I know I'm simply describing to you a behavior that my fellow scientists can quantify. But I know that there is more to my walk than just my legs moving. I know that some inner force decided to go for a walk, and that same inner force enjoyed the flowers and birds and the beauty of nature. Thoughts that science will never be able to measure or quantify. That statement came from a rigid behavioralist with whom I spent hundreds of hours quantifying the exact frequencies of sounds that monkeys can hear. When I reflect on what he said, I remember the works of Wilder Penfield. Wilder Penfield is widely recognized as the father of neurosurgery. Educated at Princeton, Oxford, and Johns Hopkins, he is responsible for much of our current understanding of brain functions. Among other things, Penfield did extensive mapping of the brain in the 1930s and 40s. To do this, he electrically stimulated various areas of patients' brains during neurosurgery. For example, electrical stimulation of the motor cortex would result in the movement of the arms or legs. Other areas were documented as being responsible for speech, hearing, vision, and so forth. Penfield, like many of his medical cohorts, thought for many years that there was no soul or independent consciousness in human beings. He believed that the neurons of the brain could explain all human behavior. 50 years later, and in frail health, Penfield changed his mind. As he said in his last work, The Mystery of the Mind, I came to take seriously, even to believe, that the consciousness of man, the mind, is not something to be reduced to brain mechanism. Penfield went on to say that determining the connection between mind and brain is the ultimate of ultimate problems. After years of observing human brains in conscious patients, which went beyond the work of his peers who arrived at their conclusions through psychotherapy or by examining brains of experimental animals, Penfield believed something differentiated the mind from the physical brain. Pondering the ultimate of ultimate questions, this physician-philosopher asked himself the question, what becomes of the mind after death? After 50 years of studying the living brain, Wilder Penfield realized that the answer to that question, is there a soul, was more elusive than ever. Perhaps the soul does not appear on the latest machine invented by man to study the brain. I believe that by looking carefully at the work of neuroscientists, one can conclude that there is within the human brain an area that is genetically coded for out-of-body experiences, tunnel experiences, and much of what we know as the near-death experience. After the Seattle study, in which we determined that a person must be on the brink of death to have a near-death experience, we asked ourselves another question. What is the relationship of NDEs to hallucinations and other psychic phenomena? We researched the medical literature and found that near-death experiences are unique. No other hallucinations, visions, or psychic phenomena are identical to NDEs. I will have to say I was surprised. I assumed that I would find many drugs that mimicked the experience. I was mystified to find that marijuana, psychedelics, alcohol, narcotics, anesthetic agents, Valium, a lack of oxygen to the body, or severe psychological stresses do not cause NDEs. Our research stumped me. I was not alone in my inability to find drug or psychological causes for NDEs. A number of researchers, including Raymond Moody, psychologist Kenneth Ring, and even astronomer Carl Sagan, could find no common pathway to explain the near-death experience. Except near-death, that is. My first hint of a solution to this problem came when I was casually discussing NDEs with Art Ward, former chairman of neurosurgery at the University of Washington. Art Ward is a great thinker, a surgical artist, and a crusty old man whose shoot-from-the-hip style causes many junior residents to cower in fear. He is not given to metaphysical thinking. Hard science and just the facts are his domain. Yet when I described NDEs to him, he was already very familiar with them. He had heard them recounted from many of his own patients. Ward remembered one patient who experienced every trait of the near-death experience while Wilder Penfield poked an area of his brain with an electrical probe. As part of the patient's brain was stimulated, he had the sensation of leaving his body. When another area close by was stimulated, He had the sensation of zooming up a tunnel, and so forth. Ward thought that the area Penfield was probing was the right temporal lobe. He felt that some very interesting experiments could have been conducted had they thought of them at the time. For example, they might have devised ways to see if these people were really leaving their bodies. Unfortunately, said Ward, nobody thought of it at the time. This was an intriguing lead. Our team of researchers began to examine Penfield's work. Buried in a 40-year-old textbook, we found clear references to areas of the brain that, when electrically stimulated, produced out-of-body experiences. At times, patients on his operating table would say, "I'm leaving my body now," when he touched the right temporal lobe with an electric probe. Several reported saying, "I'm half in and half out." The area he was mapping was the Sylvan fissure, an area in the right temporal lobe located just above the right ear. When he electrically stimulated the surrounding areas of the fissure, patients frequently had the experience of seeing God. They heard beautiful music, saw dead friends and relatives, and even had a panoramic life review. This was an exciting find. Up until this point, the existence of archetypes was only a theory from psychotherapist Carl Jung, who described them as being psychological phenomena present in the genetic makeup of all people, regardless of race, creed, or color. We were stumped. We had confirmed the specific area of the brain where NDEs occur, but we didn't know what was actually happening when they occurred. Someone proposed that this experience was a defense mechanism, a way for the body to fool itself into believing it was surviving death. That theory made sense to a point, but it didn't explain the reason that these experiences were so consistent from one subject to the next. After all, why would a person on the brink of death almost always have an experience that was so similar to what another person on the brink of death experienced? Why were they leaving their bodies, zooming up tunnels, seeing beings of light, and all those other things? Why weren't they having experiences so individual that they couldn't be categorized? That the distress of near death causes a neurological response almost explains it, but there is some research that can't be ignored. The research on out-of-body experiences represents very compelling evidence that something is leaving the body. Michael Sabom, an Atlanta cardiologist, has done some fascinating work on out-of-body experiences and people who almost died of cardiac arrest. In these experiences, a person in a near-death crisis claims to leave his body and watch his own resuscitation in the emergency room or during surgery. Sabom had 32 such patients in his study. Sabom asked 25 medically savvy patients to make educated guesses about what happens when a doctor tries to get the heart started again. He wanted to compare the knowledge of medically smart patients with the out-of-body experiences of medically unsophisticated patients. He found that 23 of the 25 in the control group made major mistakes in describing the resuscitation procedure. On the other hand, none of the near-death patients made mistakes in describing what went on in their own resuscitations. This presents very strong evidence that these people were actually outside their bodies and looking down as they said they were. Sabom's research represents excellent empirical evidence of a life out of body, or at least an extremely sensitive sixth sense. So did many of the stories we had heard from patients and other doctors. In 1986, when it came time to publish our findings about the anatomical location of near-death experiences, we entirely ignored the spiritual implications. We all agreed that bridging the gap between psychology and neurology was a big step in itself. As the head of neurology said, "Let's leave out any of that metaphysical stuff we were talking about." It was felt to be too controversial, too far out. Our papers were published without the words soul or spirit appearing anywhere in them. Afterwards, some of us continued to discuss this area in the brain in a different light. We began to ponder several questions. Does this information demystify the near-death experience? Does the fact that we know where the experience originates make it more a reflex than a spiritual experience? We ultimately answered no to this question. Like Wilder Penfield and others who had done brain research, we now knew where in the brain a certain action took place. We didn't know why. There are many other examples of genetic imprinting within the human brain, and none of those functions is any less valid for being inborn. For instance, we are all born with the capacity to learn language. This built-in language analyzer enables us to learn the language of our society. This ability to analyze language is genetically part of our brains, although it is strongly influenced by environment, which is why the French speak French and Americans speak English with an American accent. Birds are another example of animals that have genetically imprinted information in their brains. They are born with a detailed map of the night sky that is somehow passed to them through genetic tissue. Birds do not need to learn what the sky looks like. They come equipped with an inner map of the heavens. Rather than diminish the NDE, we should consider the metaphysical ramifications of the phenomena. As Penfield said, "I have no doubt the day will dawn when the mystery of the mind will no longer be a mystery. But I believe that one should not pretend to draw a final scientific conclusion in man's study of man until the nature of the energy responsible for mind action is discovered." When my research team published its report on the anatomy of the near-death experience, we were contacted by a group of neurologists in Chile who had been studying the same thing. They arrived at the same anatomical conclusions that we did, that near-death experiences were generated by neuron activity within the Sylvan fissure. Learning that other scientists had reached the same conclusion independently told us that we had at least discovered the circuit boards of mysticism. In our hearts, some of us believed strongly that we had discovered the seat of the soul. As so frequently happens, children can sum up difficult concepts with a few innocently spoken words. Such was the case with one child who spoke to researcher Elizabeth Kubler-Ross about death and the nature of the soul. When he was asked what heaven looked like in his vision, he tried his best to explain it. It's sort of like if you went through another passageway. You walked right through a wall to another galaxy or something. It's sort of like walking into your brain. And it's sort of like living on a cloud and your spirit is there, but not your body. You've left your body. It's really like walking into your mind. For him, there was no contradiction between believing that heaven is in his mind and that he can leave his body and meet his grandfather in heaven. There was no contradiction for Dr. Penfield either. In one of his lectures on the brain, he tackled the question of the soul with a directness frequently used by senior statesmen to attack thorny issues. "It is clear that in order to survive after death," Penfield said, "the mind must establish a connection with a source of energy other than that of the brain." I love this quote, both for what it says and for what it implies. It says that the mind is one thing, the brain another, and that the brain cannot do what the mind does. It implies that people may communicate through the mind's energy with other people and or with God, and that when the body dies, the mind may be forced to rely upon another source of energy for its existence. Our understanding of the spiritual is very shallow. We search and search for the source of spiritual experiences, mapping the brain to find where these phenomena occur. For the most part, we forget that it isn't so important how they happened as it is that they happen. The great psychologist William James said that such mystical experiences as NDEs are so personal that they are beyond words. As he put it, they are pure and simple, an experience of light. The source of this light may forever remain a mystery. There is another aspect of the near-death experience that neuroscience hasn't been able to account for: the light. Nearly every near-death experience of children, and about 1/4 of those of adults, has in it an element of light. They all report that the light appears at the final stages of the NDE, after they have had an out-of-body experience or have traveled up the tunnel. Most people who experience the light say that it's more than just light. There is substance to it that wraps them in a warmth and caring that they have never felt before. For some, the voice of God comes from the light. Seeing the light results in an incredible change in attitude that affects many of them for the rest of their lives. Where the rest of the experience is extraordinary, the light makes it mystical. It is the truth of the near-death experience. Most of the patients I've spoken to describe it essentially as a pure light of unconditional love. Others call it all-knowing, all-forgiving, and all-loving. One patient, 20 years after seeing the light at age 5, told me, "I will never forget that light. It is with me all the time." Another patient who had an NDE as a child said to me, "Others have seen God, but I only saw a light that I will never forget." The light is one element of the near-death experience that brain researchers can't even come close to explaining. The testimony of children is clear on this point. The light is the key element of the NDE. How can we scientifically explain this light after death? I do not know of any biochemical or psychological explanation for why we would experience a bright light as the final stage of bodily death. The rigidly reductionistic among us could explain NDEs in the following manner. A person is faced with a life-threatening event. He or she leaves the physical body and watches what is happening in a detached and depersonalized manner. This has many useful functions in that a person does not feel pain or panic, and can even deny that his or her life is being threatened with death. As we know from the works of Wilder Penfield, this can sometimes be explained as the right temporal lobe being stimulated by a lack of oxygen. Then there is the life review, seeing lights and people, hearing noises, having feelings of great joy and peace, and seeing heavenly places. Surely, the skeptics say, these are simple psychological events which can be explained by examining the brain's organic processes. As the brain begins its final dying process, there is a collapse of the visual fields and tunnel vision results. The eyes are no longer seeing, and the brain can no longer interpret what it sees. The tunnel becomes dark, and the organism dies. This is possibly explained by some recent research as being an interruption of blood flow in the posterior cerebral artery, which feeds blood to the area of our brain responsible for sight. And then there's light. Where does this light come from? The brain has nearly stopped functioning. The psychological processes I've just described took place in a few minutes, although they seemed longer to the beholder, and now all mental functions have ceased. One would assume that the bodily functions would simply cease, that there would be eternal darkness. Then why the light? I feel I have done as much as anyone to outline the known neurological processes that can explain near-death experiences. Although many of the NDE elements can be explained by our knowledge of the way the brain works, the one that remains a true mystery is the experience of light. Whereas most of the traits of the NDE can be precisely located in the anatomy of the brain, there is no explanation for what happens when the seat of consciousness travels through the tunnel and enters the light. Like the birth of a child, it is the end product of an anatomical process that involves a voyage down a tunnel toward a world of color and brightness. Perhaps this light somehow represents a birth into a spiritual realm. After all, many of the anecdotes from children seem to indicate such a possibility. Some of their stories seem to link the light with rebirth. In one of these accounts, a 4-year-old girl, using a flashlight to go down the cellar stairs, stepped off the edge of the wrong side of the landing and fell to the cement floor far below. At a later age, she described what happened to her. The next thing I was aware of was being held up near the ceiling over the foot of the stairs. The light was dim, and at first I saw nothing unusual. Then I saw myself lying face down on the cement over to the side of the stairway. I was a little surprised, but not at all upset at seeing myself that way. I watched and saw that I didn't move at all. After a while, I said to myself, I guess I'm dead. But I felt good, better than I ever had felt. I realized I probably wouldn't be going back to my mother, but I wasn't afraid at all. I noticed the dim light growing slowly brighter. The source of the light was not in the basement, but far behind and slightly above me. I looked over my shoulder into the most beautiful light imaginable. It seemed to be at the end of a long tunnel which was gradually getting brighter and brighter as more and more of the light entered it. It was yellow-white and brilliant, but not painful to look at even directly. As I turned to face the light with my full body, I felt happier than I ever had before, or have since. Then the light was gone. I felt groggy and sick with a terrible headache. I only wanted my mother and to stop my head from hurting. It has long been my belief that many of the world's greatest religious leaders have been driven by profound near-death or other visionary experiences that involve this same mystical light. There are many such examples of people being turned toward a life of devotion by the light. Often these occur during childhood. One of my own patients had such an experience at the age of 15. He died of a severe infection. While doctors rushed to begin heart massage, he saw a light at the end of his bed. It grew larger and larger until it totally engulfed him. Then from the brightness came a wonderfully kind face that was thousands of years old, yet without wrinkles. He was frightened by what he saw, a fear that was eliminated when the man touched his forehead. After that, he knew he wanted to become a minister. Now, 30 years later, he is a mainstream Protestant minister who brings that vision of the light to others. Native American spiritual leader Black Elk had a near-fatal illness at age 9 that put him in touch with the light. The illness he described resembles rheumatic fever. He says that he had a high fever and swollen joints. He had a long and detailed experience rich with religious imagery and visions of dead relatives. The very heart of his experience occurred when he was on the highest mountain of them all, and beneath him was the entire world. A bright light surrounded the earth, wide as daylight. In Autobiography of a Yogi, the Indian guru Paramahansa Yogananda describes his near-death experience at age 8, which then enhanced his lifelong devotion to religion. In that autobiography, he states, "There was a blinding light enveloping my body and the entire room. My nausea and other uncontrollable symptoms disappeared. I was well." The light then stayed with him the rest of his life, and he was able to illuminate others with it. I think the light seen during NDEs and this mystical light seen by those having spiritual experiences are the same light. Both fuel religious awe, and both have the power to transform. As psychologist William James said in his book, Varieties of Religious Experience, the hallmark of religious experience involves a sense of being bathed in a warm glow of light. Earth heaven and sea resounding as if in one vast world-encircling harmony. I have heard young children struggling to explain the same thing to me about the light at the end of the tunnel. The question of great interest is, where is the light located? Is it outside the body, representing a place that we go? Or is it just a flash of primal energy within our brains? A sort of supernova of the ego, perhaps? This has not been my primary question in researching near-death experiences. My research has been aimed at helping the patient work closer with the medical team and at an understanding of the deep workings of our psyches that affect the dying process. Through my work, I would like to prevent the turning away from the dying patient and family that is done by physicians and their support staff. It has been my hope that these near-death experiences will teach us all how to listen to each other, will break down the walls of isolation and grief that shield us from death. However, in the course of conducting this research, I have come to believe that there is a possibility that this light is located outside our bodies. When I began my research, I would never have dreamed that I would speak those words. But the testimony of children and many of their unexplainable encounters have convinced me. A young girl we'll call June first made me think that the light is not just located in the mind. She was an 8-year-old patient who nearly drowned in Seattle's Puget Sound when she fell out of her father's fishing boat. On an overcast day, she flipped over the side and sank 20 feet to the bottom. Her father turned the boat around, and a close family friend jumped into the murky water and began searching for her. 3 times he dove to the bottom of the sound, possessed by the strength and heroism that an emergency can evoke. He could see nothing because of the turbulent waters and the overcast day. On the 4th dive, he suddenly saw her body. He described it as illuminated from within by a soft, bright light. This man told me later that he had a sense of awe and reverence. He pulled her lifeless body from the depths and they raced her to a hospital. Despite being underwater for at least 20 minutes, she lived. A few days later, both men returned to the site with scuba gear. The man who saved June had told everyone about the light. Now he wanted to see just how much natural light actually reached the bottom of the sound on a sunny day. Both men dove down and both said that they could see only a few feet in front of their eyes. I believe that she was having a near-death experience, and that both she and her rescuer were seeing the light at the same time. There have been other instances in which the light has intervened to save children. In 1986, David Young and his family carried an arsenal of weapons and a bomb into an elementary school in Cokeville, Wyoming. After holding 156 children hostage and threatening to kill them all, Young detonated the bomb, destroying the entire school. Not one of the children was harmed. How did this miracle of survival happen? Many of the children described seeing people of light who directed them to safety before the explosion occurred. Others talked about hearing the voice of an adult who told them where to go to avoid the bomb's blast. One girl described her experience in detail. They, meaning the people of light, were standing there above us. There was a mother and a father, and a lady holding a tiny baby, and a little girl with long hair. There was a family of people. The woman told us that a bomb was going to go off soon and to listen to our brother. She said to be sure we did what he told us. They were dressed in white, bright like light bulbs, but brighter around the face. The woman made me feel good. I knew she loved me. The girl's brother stated, I didn't see anything. I just heard a voice tell me to find my little sisters and to take them over by the window and keep them there. They were playing with their friends and they did not want to move. I took them to the window and helped them through. Another 6-year-old child also testified that a lady told me that a bomb was going to go off soon. She told me to go over to the window and hurry out. This type of dramatic yet verifiable evidence of the light intervening in our lives is extraordinarily rare. It is difficult for me to believe it, even when I read eyewitness accounts of those who were present or actually interview the witnesses myself. It is frequently hard for the witnesses to believe. With June, for instance, her father and the rescuer could hardly believe that the light had originated from within her in a supernatural fashion, even though the man who saved her swears he saw it. Indeed, we find it hard to believe in something we cannot understand. Yet still these experiences of light happen. Here's a story that comes from a professional acquaintance. A family was caring for their dying grandmother. In addition to the ravages of old age, she was in her 80s, she had arthritis and heart disease. The parents discouraged their daughter from spending too much time around the grandmother. They felt that the rapid deterioration of a family member was too horrible a sight for their 9-year-old child to witness. One day, the child was drawn to the grandmother's room. She went in for a few minutes and then came out with a puzzled look on her face. "Mommy," she said, "there are 2 grandmothers. I saw 2 grannies in the room. First I talked to Granny, and then a lighted lady named Beth came and talked to me and Granny. And then they left together." The mother and daughter went into the room and discovered that the grandmother had died. This was a very convincing experience for the mother. The genuine manner in which the event was presented by her daughter was evidence enough for her. The mother felt that further proof was provided by the lighted granny named Beth. For Beth was the name of her great-grandmother, someone the little girl had not heard about. Could this light, seen by the person having a near-death experience and occasionally seen by others, be a physical manifestation of our guardian angel or guiding light? Many children have described guardian angels who were all white and escorted them to heaven. For example, this experience happened to a child who had a reaction to antibiotics that put her into anaphylactic shock, a sometimes fatal reaction to drugs. She had an out-of-body experience, went up a tunnel, saw a paradise of light, and was engulfed by a godlike light. During this spiritual journey, she also met a guardian angel named Sarah. This near-death experience occurred 20 years ago. Yet remarkably, Sarah has never left this woman's side. During periods of stress, Sarah reappears to provide solace and advice. The woman and Sarah have had in-depth discussions about several earthly problems, including marital strife, job difficulties, the difficulties of raising children. When she needs her, Sarah is always there. All this woman needs to do is to sit alone in a quiet place and ask for her presence. Until recently, my patient thought that Sarah was invisible. Then a remarkable thing happened. She was having extraordinary problems with her teenage son, who was failing school, staying out late at night, and generally being rebellious in the worst of teenage traditions. Waiting up for him to return after a night out on the town, my patient sat in her darkened family room and called up Sarah. For the next half hour, the woman and her guardian angel had a heart-to-heart talk about the difficulties of raising teenage boys. Little did my patient know that her son had come home and had witnessed half of their discussion, watching the angel and his mother talk as he peeked around a corner. In the morning, he confronted her with what he had seen. "Mom," he said, "who was that woman you were talking to last night? She seemed real nice." What else could my patient do? She told her son about her constant companion, Sarah. She then sought me out because of my interest in NDEs. She said she needed a medical opinion as to her sanity. Did I think she was crazy? After talking to her for a while, I had to say that I didn't think she was crazy at all. "What am I?" she then asked. I thought for a moment. Lucky, I guess. According to science, death should mean the extinction of life and light. Biologically speaking, we should close our eyes at the end of life's process, and that should be it. Extinction of consciousness, absence of light. We know, especially from the experiences of children, that such an extinction does not occur in a near-death situation. These children tell us that there is a darkness, an end to the light we experience every day, but then there is another light, one that represents love and has a lot of good things in it for me, as one boy told me. This light is the core near-death experience and cannot be explained by any scientific theories. I have documented the anatomical areas of the brain where the source of NDEs is located. But there is no scientific explanation for the light. All we know is that at the point of death, a brilliant, beautiful, loving, and peaceful light awaits us. Children even draw pictures of the light. In fact, when I ask children to draw pictures of what happened to them during their near-death experience, they almost always include a representation of the light. It is fascinating to me that these children, sometimes as young as 2 and 3 years old, use the same descriptions of the light as the previously mentioned spiritual leaders use in their descriptions of the light of God. If we assume that this experience of the light is simply a spasm of rigor mortis in the optic nerve, then how can we account for all of the higher order processing of unconditional love, total truth, and feelings of deep peace and joy? If it is a final death spasm of the optic nerve, patients would simply say, "I saw a blinding bright light." Using Freud's model of the mind, some psychologists have attempted to explain the light as merely the internalized parents, the superego coming to the rescue in the form of the being of light. Although that is as good an explanation as I have ever heard for the light, it still leaves much to be explained. If the light is merely a product of the superego, why is it sometimes visible outside the dying person's body? There are more questions than answers when dealing with the light. I would like to believe that the light is where we go when we die. Like the birth into a bright new world, the light of the NDE represents a beginning of a new beginning. It has been 8 years now since I first met Katie, the little girl who was so close to death from drowning that the pupils of her eyes didn't respond to bright light, is now a lovely teenager who seems normal in every way. I have stayed in close contact with Katie and her family. Her parents think that she is as charming and bright as a teenage girl can be. But Katie's parents have 6 children, and they think all of them are model kids. Which isn't to say that Katie's experience hasn't had a profound effect upon her life. It did. Katie and her parents feel that her NDE made her a different person in many ways. Katie feels that God sent her back to be a help to her mother. She has been just that. She is an extraordinarily mature 15-year-old who helps her mother run a large household. She has a part-time job, gets good grades, excels in ballet, and has never taken drugs. "Why should I need drugs?" she asks, wrinkling her nose in disbelief at the question. These effects on Katie intrigued me. I began to wonder about adults who had NDEs during childhood. Did they embellish their experiences as they became adults until they were more fiction than fact? And what about the effects of those NDEs on their lives? Do they feel chosen or special? Do they think that they have greater insights because of their spiritual experiences? I searched my files for cases of people who had had near-death experiences as children and again as adults to see if there were differences in the NDEs. Since I have discussed this topic on several television and radio programs, many people have contacted me. At first I was puzzled by this. Why were they calling me when they had already told their stories dozens of times? Then I realized that they wanted a sympathetic ear from the medical community. For the most part, they had been ignored by their doctors when they told of their marvelous journeys. Sometimes they were even ridiculed or diagnosed as temporarily insane. They came to me for acceptance from a physician. Rather than treat these patients as though something were wrong with them, I listen willingly, jotting notes while they tell me their intriguing stories. Later, I consult with their physicians or check their medical records to make sure that they didn't have histories of mental problems. I found in my files 2 patients who each had 2 NDEs, one as a child and the other as an adult. The first case concerns a woman who at age 2 had an NDE while suffering from pneumonia, and at the age of 69, her second after a cardiac arrest. Here, in her own words, were both of the experiences. When I was 2, she says, I had measles and then came down with pneumonia as a result. That was in the days before antibiotics, and the doctor said that there was nothing he could do for me. I don't remember hearing him say that, since I was only 2, but it's amazing what I do remember. My mother was making a poultice for my chest when I suddenly died. The doctor was there, and he began shaking me. It turned dark all around me, and then I saw a bright light that I knew was from God. I had the deepest possible experience from being in the light. I felt love and comfort. I wasn't frightened. I only wondered, oh my, how will I get back in my body? Then suddenly I was back in, looking up at my mother and the doctor. When I got older, I could still see sparkles from that light whenever I was in a dark room. It kept me from being afraid. 62 years later, this woman had another NDE. Here is her vivid description of that experience. I was over at the garage getting my car fixed when suddenly, boom, I was out of my body. It happened so fast. The mechanic just stared at me. I have never been able to get him to talk about what he saw in me that day. Whenever I bring it up, he always says, no problem, and sort of backs away. This was the beginning of all my heart problems. But it really wasn't such a bad way to begin. I was part in and part out of my body. I then had the most marvelous time bouncing in and out of my body. And then, all of a sudden, I was in a velvety black place. But I wasn't frightened, since I was always there with, well, God. And I wasn't dreaming. I was in a black void, and I knew I was dead, but I wasn't frightened. Then suddenly there came a fog, and right in the center was my beautiful amber light. I was filled with complete knowledge and wonderment. I felt as though I was skating, and that if I could just go out there and skate a pattern, that it would be the most beautiful pattern of all. I could only imagine that God was with me, and that He controlled everything I saw and thought. It was so glorious to be up there with Him. There was an amber light, and above it a huge angel. I think it was my guardian angel. To the right of the light was a huge plank, a giant 4x4 that stretched beside me. It was covered with a horrible green paint. I didn't want to touch it because it was my barrier. God told me that if you were meant to go back, they put up a barrier. Sometimes it's a cliff. Sometimes it's a waterfall. Mine was a green plank. Then He took me into the light. Light was pouring through me. My cheeks were bulging out. It was most delicious. A wonderful experience of that light passing through me. And then the plank came in front of me, and God was laughing behind me. He took my hand and put it on the plank. I looked down into a round opening in the black void in which people were walking around in white robes. Some people remained in the void, especially if they had committed suicide. He said, "You can't go down there." I then knew I was going to return to my body. I knew I was so sick that I would never make it, but I was given no chance. I came back to the world. This second case study of a patient who had an NDE as a child and again as an adult is a woman I'll call Paula. She wrote to me to report her childhood experience after a lecture I gave in Seattle. I had an NDE as a child that was extremely simple, she said. When I was 9 years old, I was put under anesthesia to have teeth removed. I had a cardiac arrest as a result of an allergic reaction to the anesthetic. I saw myself rolled into a very tight ball of light. I saw myself being hurled at a very great speed through a conical-shaped space. The ball was rotating at a very high speed and glowing with a warm, bright light. Sticking out from the ball were a hand and a foot. That is all I can remember. I spoke with her later to hear about her adult experience, which happened 16 years later when she was 25. She had just had a child and had been hospitalized for severe high blood pressure associated with pregnancy. At 3 a.m. on the second day of her stay, Paula awoke with the sense that the air in the hospital room was very heavy. She struggled to the door, opened it, and then fell backward. Hospital records show that she had a cardiac arrest due to a heart attack. Paula says that there was no pain associated with the heart attack. She first went into a black void and then felt as though she had left her body and was able to watch everything from a position near the ceiling. She tells the rest. I was looking down at nurses who gathered around my body. There were 3. One began taking my pulse and then yelled to the other 2, "Call a doctor, call her husband." A doctor showed up almost immediately and after a brief examination said, "She's dying." I was able to go out into the hallway and see my aunt. She was a nurse in the same hospital and was standing outside my room talking to some patients from other rooms. "What a shame," she said. "She was such a good little mother." I was puzzled by the fact that they were talking about me in the past tense. I tried to talk to them, to tell them I was there, but I couldn't communicate with them. I was even able to go into the next room, where another patient was complaining about all the noise. I then went back to my body in time to see my husband who had just arrived. He was watching the doctor and saying, "What am I going to tell the children?" I then thought that I might be dead. My next thought was not fear, but the feeling that this might be a neat experience. I wanted to tell them that I was there, that I could listen to them and watch them. But I couldn't talk to them or communicate in any way. It was frustrating. As I watched them work on my body, the room became very light. Then a canopy of color grew above me, like the canopy that is over the front door of a nightclub. It was made of blue and silver rain, and there was a very bright light in the middle of it. The air sparkled around this light, and I knew that the light was where I wanted to go. From this light came other people. There was no God or spiritual guide with them, only these ordinary people like myself, who were people of light. Finally, I came back to look at my body and saw a doctor shaking my shoulder saying, "Paula, Paula, come back." That was when I came back into my body and awoke. These experiences illustrate the flavor of childhood experiences as compared to those of adults. Research done by Nancy Evans Bush at the International Association for Near-Death Studies has shown that childhood NDEs are very similar to those of adults, in that they contain the core experience of leaving the body, being in a void, and then being encompassed by the light. One striking difference was the lack of a life review. In the 17 childhood NDEs Bush examined, not one had a life review. Yet the other events were every bit as powerful as any found in the adult literature. These experiences contain the same elements as adult NDEs. Children's experiences are the same as adults, except they don't have a life review. In none of the childhood experiences that Bush examined was a life review present. where it is a feature of 25% of adult NDEs. Why was there no life review present? I believe that the reason children don't have a life review is simply that they don't yet have much of a life. After all, how much life does a 7-year-old child have to review? I decided to research the stories of adults who had NDEs as children. This type of research is known as anecdotal and is simply the analysis of stories gathered in a methodical fashion. This isn't to say that this type of research isn't valuable in a scientific sense. Many scientific advances have been made by anecdotal research. Virtually all of our infant feeding practices, for instance, have been developed through anecdotal research. The use of aspirin to prevent heart attacks is also the result of anecdotal research. Aware of the validity of anecdotal research, I devised a study to interview self-referred patients about their childhood NDEs. The people with whom I spoke were from such various professions as a scientist, an insurance claims adjuster, and a graphic artist. Some had only completed 11th grade. Some were high school graduates, and others had graduated from college. Although most had been raised as Christians, none was particularly religious. They all described themselves as being typically middle class. All of them, of course, had to have suffered a near-fatal event that could be verified by medical records. None could be mentally ill or drug users. We were also careful not to bias the patients by the questions we asked. The interviews were completely open-ended and non-directed. Typical of the questions were these. What do you remember about your experience? Tell me about it. What happened next? Such sparse questioning would prevent the patient from being led by the nose, as a colleague put it, towards some experience that might not have happened. As a further control, I had the help of Kim Clark, a clinical instructor at the University of Washington and a near-death researcher. Although we used the same basic questionnaire, we worked separately. This enabled me to compare the types of anecdotes that Kim Clark collected with the type that I collected, so that we could check our methods of questioning patients. If our results were significantly different, then we would know that one of us was doing our job wrong. Despite differences in training, sex, personality, and even very different opinions as to the meanings of NDEs, our results were very similar. I would like to present some of the fascinating stories from these patients with my conclusions. Mike is a scientist of international reputation in his 40s who nearly drowned at the age of 5. He was pulled from a swimming pool and resuscitated by a relative. When the family finally got him to the hospital, doctors in the emergency room said that he was dead. Shortly thereafter, he spontaneously revived. When I went underwater, he said, the next thing I remembered was passing down a long tunnel. The light went from being very harsh to so bright I could feel it. Then I saw God on a throne. People, maybe angels, were below looking up at the throne. I sat on the lap of God, and he told me that I had to go back. It's not your time, he said. I wanted to stay, but I came back. Mike credits this experience with sorting out his life. From that point on, he was driven to acquire knowledge. He decided to study science and engineering, subjects that could help him to discover the natural order of things. His reputation shows that he has been successful in that endeavor. Kathleen is a bright 43-year-old who graduated from high school and has worked for the municipality where she has lived for 20 years. She has dabbled in a number of faiths, but believes only in a vague conception of God. When she was 9 years old, she was walking on a log in shallow water. Suddenly, the log turned, and she slipped underneath it into the cold water. The log pressed her into the soft mud of the riverbank and held her head underwater for a long period of time. This is how she describes the experience. Suddenly I felt very warm, although I was face down in cold water. I was suddenly under a cloudless baby blue sky, with a large fluffy circle glowing in it. From inside the circle came a hand. It was reaching for me, and the voice behind it was that of a woman. I couldn't understand what she was saying, but I knew she was anxious for me to come into the next world. I withdrew my hand because I didn't want to go. I was lucky to have been brought back to life. It is amazing how much change can come to a person's life even after such a fragmentary experience. The reason Kathleen has dabbled in so many religions is that the God she sensed in the light was not the God perceived by the many religions with which she has been involved. The rules of religion are put there by people, she said. From my brief encounter, I got the idea that being one with God is something that can be done without rules. Bill is a 50-year-old who had his near-death experience at the age of 9 while working on his family farm. He was siphoning gas out of a tractor when he accidentally inhaled it. Inhaled gasoline can cause rapid pneumonia, which in this case cut off his oxygen. As his brother began screaming for help, Bill fell to the ground and quickly blacked out. He recalled it this way. All of a sudden, I couldn't move. I found myself floating into a dark tunnel. I saw light, and the closer I floated to it, the more I liked it. When I got to the portal opening to the light and was just ready to step through, I felt a combination of relief, joy, and pleasure. I just wanted to be inside the light. Suddenly a hand reached out and grabbed me. "He's a feisty rascal, isn't he?" said a voice. "Well, Bill, it's not your time this time. You have a job to do." Suddenly I was above my body. I saw my brother below me. I saw my father rush to him, and I heard him say, "My God, my God." I felt okay. I wasn't afraid. Then I saw my other brother racing across the fields. I saw my dad shaking me, and I was spitting out gasoline and gagging and choking. And then I came to. When I asked Bill what this experience has meant to him over the years, he quickly pointed out that he has never been afraid to die. "I know that where we are going is a beautiful place," he said. "Because of that, I have never carried that burden of fear with me that many people have about death." Did he think he was being saved for something special? Bill shook his head. "I've been married 30 years, raised 5 children, and built my own company to the success it is today. To me, that seems special." Victor is a 55-year-old engineer who is married and has 2 children. He is a veteran of World War II, during which he was diagnosed by Army psychologists as being schizophrenic and received a medical discharge. He has held a job and works since that time. He has never been hospitalized for the condition, nor has he taken drugs for it. I include him here because I really doubt that diagnosis. I think he was labeled as schizophrenic because of his near-death experience. Here is Victor's story. "When I was 5, he says, I had very bad pneumonia. It became so bad that my heart stopped. Suddenly I floated out of my body. I saw my own body and people around me. Then I found myself traveling down a tunnel and headed for a light. Then I saw him, the Messiah. I can't really describe him or explain, but I just knew it was the Messiah. He said, 'We will meet again,' and I came back to my body." As a result of this experience, Victor became very religious. He has a deep longing to see God again. The mistake he made was to tell Army psychiatrists about this deep longing after the war, when he was sent to them for battle fatigue. On the basis of that confession, he was diagnosed as schizophrenic, someone who has had an acute break with reality. Based upon his lifestyle over the past 40 years, I am willing to say that he isn't mentally ill. He isn't medicated. He is happily married. He has raised a family. He has held the same job for many years. He has never had another vision of God or anything else since that brief yet powerful experience when he was 5. It is a pity that someone knowledgeable about near-death experiences wasn't able to counsel him. He was glad to talk to me because I didn't think he was mentally ill. He said that although he never felt abnormal, the diagnosis left him feeling very peculiar about himself. This man's story reminds me of a Tibetan tale of spiritual enlightenment that I have heard many times. A man ventured into the forest to live the life of a simple holy man. He craved enlightenment and sought the meaning of life by studying books and consulting with the wise men of Tibet. Still, he felt that he was no closer to achieving his goal of true understanding. One day, his mentor died. After the funeral, he was filled with grief and sank into deep despair. In this grief, his soul left his body and soared above his head. He saw his entire life and how foolish it was. He saw how he had wasted precious years studying books instead of living life. He floated through the land and saw the world from the eyes of a bird. He realized how small everybody was from so high up. He realized how unimportant his fears and preoccupations were when compared to the whole of humanity. When he returned to his body and told of his spiritual journey, he was revered as a wise man. Jim is a 50-year-old supervisor at an aircraft manufacturing plant in Seattle. He has been married for 30 years and has 2 children. When he was 6 years old, he had a bout with scarlet fever that left him critically ill. One night, as he labored for breath in his room, he felt as though he was slipping away from this life. Suddenly I found myself in a long dark tube, he reported, with some strange and different music. There was a continuous rhythm that reminds me of the sound you can hear when you place your ear against the mouth of a long pipe. I was just flying down this tunnel toward a light. There was something at the end of this tunnel, but I can't really say what it was. I could see my body zooming toward the light, so I know I was out of my body. I was convinced that I was dead, and I really wanted to get to the end of the tunnel to see what the next life held, but I never reached it, and I don't know why. The experience had a profound effect on Jim's life. He feels that it caused him to have a better relationship with both man and God. He puts it like this: "Even as a wild young man, I always had a strong desire to help others. The experience caused me to have compassion for others, especially those who face death. I have no fear of death, and it is my responsibility to help others who have that fear." Jim feels that the experience brought him to God, even though he insists that this wasn't a religious experience for him. "I realize that others have seen God when they have these experiences," he says. "I didn't. I only saw the light, but that was enough for me." Rick is 25 years old now, an age he almost didn't see thanks to meningitis, a bacterial infection of the brain. When he was 5, he became severely ill at home after surgery to remove a fungus from his head. His parents called an ambulance, but by the time it arrived, Rick was running a high temperature and was barely holding on to life. This is how he describes what happened to him. "I remember leaving my physical body and seeing the transport team carrying me out of the house. I was following above them as they loaded my body into the ambulance. I didn't go with it. Instead, I briefly went into my sister's head and saw the world through her eyes. Then I saw my father weeping as he got into the car to take the family to the hospital. He was sure I was going to die, and I felt sorry that my possible death was causing him this kind of pain. I went ahead to the hospital to see what kind of room I was going to get. I saw a girl who was about 12 years old in the room I was supposed to go into. Since I was so sick, they decided to move her and give me the room alone. I then left the earth and traveled down a long tunnel. I came to a bright opening and passed through it. Out in the brightness, I was engulfed by fog. There seemed to be a border, something like a waterline on the beach that separated me from the true light. I knew that if I entered the light, I would not return to my body. The light was all love, all knowing, and the sky was warm and friendly. I was trying to decide whether I should go into the light or not when I just returned to my body. This experience amazed Rick's family because of the rich details it provided about events going on around him. Since Rick's body was in the ambulance speeding towards the hospital, an out-of-body experience would have been necessary for him to see his father crying in the family car behind him. Leaving his body and traveling ahead of the ambulance would have been necessary for him to see the 12-year-old girl being transferred from his room before he arrived at the hospital. The fact that he was comatose before leaving for the hospital and for several days thereafter makes his experience even more baffling. Rick's NDE left him with two strong beliefs. One is that life is precious, but death is nothing to be feared. The other is that we are all born with the knowledge we need to solve life's problems. The answers are all inside, he says, if we can just climb over our egos. At the age of 10, Paul ran into his kitchen and slipped on a wet floor. He landed on his stomach so hard that he ruptured his spleen. According to his medical records, he swelled with fluids and went into shock from internal bleeding. His parents rushed him to the hospital, where his heart stopped. This is what he experienced. I left my body, Paul told me, although I still felt I was connected to it by a string. I floated up to a corner of the room and watched as 3 doctors worked frantically to rescue me. I was sure I was going to die. And I have to admit that I found their efforts to save me kind of funny. I then went down a long tunnel and approached a warm light. At the other end of the tunnel, I was met by a being who talked to me. I thought of him as a greeter then, and that is what I still call him. He was a greeter. The greeter was not in physical form. Rather, he was more a feeling or an awareness. He told me that I could not stay in the tunnel, that I had to either go back or continue on. If I continued, there would be no return. I didn't make an actual decision to return, but I did get an idea from the greeter that there was a purpose to my life. While I was thinking about whether to stay or return, I felt myself enter my body. I was about the size of a BB when I went into my body. I then expanded and filled up all the space. For a while, I longed for that light. Then I realized that someday I would see it again. In the meantime, I had things to do. The feeling that there is a purpose to life is one of the results of many childhood near-death experiences. Much as the near-death experience itself, that purpose may have meaning only to the person who receives the message. Paul's purpose was family. He believes that he was made to live because he was to have a loving relationship with his family, especially his autistic son. For some reason, Paul says, somebody thought that it was important that I have a family and nourish it. I am sure that that is the reason I was left here on earth. Here is another story about a boy named Ed. When Ed was only 5 years old, he released the emergency brake on the family car and became trapped in the car door as it rolled down their steep driveway and into the road. His father dug him out from under the left rear tire and began giving him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. His mother ran down the hill with the car keys, and the parents began a frantic race to the hospital to save their son. Ed describes what happened next. I saw myself sitting between my parents, as though I was outside the front window and looking in, he says. I could see everything. My parents had panic on their faces, and both of them were crying. My face was bruised and battered, and it looked as though every single blood vessel had burst. How long I was outside the car, I don't know. But suddenly, I began to float up, and then everything became dark. Then I felt like I was speeding up. Soon I was traveling at a tremendous speed in total darkness. It was like I imagined space travel to be. Suddenly, I felt I was standing on a loading dock with a very powerful and bright light hanging over my head. This light was very bright and filled with love and knowledge. I was there with a man, but I couldn't see him clearly because of the bright light. Thoughts were coming into my mind from the bright light. I felt a loving God and a love for people in general. There was also beautiful music and vocals like a choir that I couldn't quite understand. It became clear from Ed's first few days out of the hospital that the experience had transformed him. The first sign came at church when the preacher was talking about a fearful and terrible God. This disturbed Ed. He told his mother that he didn't want to attend church anymore. In grade school, he spoke frequently about the need to love one another. When pressed, he would tell teachers and classmates about the time he saw God. This led to problems in class, and eventually he was sent to school psychologists, who told him he had too vivid an imagination. In college, he studied philosophy of religion and learned techniques for meditation. Sometimes, when deep in meditation, he can see the light again. Those moments are bliss, says Ed, because he can re-experience the event that led to his faith. Over the years, Ed has been the target of a great deal of ridicule for talking openly about his near-death experience and the philosophy of life it gave him. For years, he was hurt by the callous reactions of people. Now, after hearing about the experiences of others who have had NDEs, he realizes that most people ridicule him because they have never had such a powerful and transformative experience. It's a relief to finally come to that conclusion, he told me. I feel lucky to have had the experience. Unfortunately, so many of us require many years just to incorporate the experience into our lives. I used to feel hurt when people made fun of me for seeing a light. Now I'm understanding. After all, if they haven't had such an experience, how can I expect them to understand what I'm talking about? Let's ask Mark about this.
When I died, I was floating out of my body. I could see my body lying there. I could see the doctors and nurses working on me. And as I was floating up, I could see my mom and my grandpa and grandma way down at the other end of the hall. And I haven't seen them for a long time. And I wanted to get to them, but there was like a three-dimensional wall that I couldn't get through. And I tried to like go up against the wall, through the wall, underneath the wall, over the wall, but there was no way through it. And I could still see my body lying there. And eventually I just kept on floating up, and there was nowhere to go except straight up. And then like I passed through another dimension, and I was in total darkness and at the very, very bottom of the tunnel, and there was nowhere to go except straight up. So I started crawling straight up, and at first it was very, very hard to crawl. It was like very steep. I'd crawl like 2 feet, fall down a foot. And after I got about halfway to the top, it got a little bit easier, and I seen a little bit of light, and that little bit of light attracted me. And as I got about 3/4 of the way to the top, it started getting really, really bright, and it started getting really, really easier. And as I got to the very, very top, there was like a gush of wind that just blew me to the top out of the tunnel. And as I got around, I never hit the ground. I floated like a glide, I guess you can say is the best way to describe it. And I never touched the ground. And as I got out there, everything was really bright, but it was just like room light. It wasn't real sunlight or nothing, but it was bright yellow and red lights, and there was gold all over the place. Real bright gold, really pretty. Nothing but gold all over. And as I was on my way, I could see these people. They were just, they weren't faces, they were just white clouded people. And I never approached them, they never approached me. They didn't have a happy or scary face, but it was like a warmth and kind of love. And I kind of sat there and looked at them a little. And then I was on my way, as in I turned around and went the other way and started gliding down the golden roads. All of a sudden, this guy appeared in front of me, and he said, my name is God, and I'm going to help you. And he said, we're going to go down for a glide down the golden roads. And so we did, and we stopped, and he asked me, how do I feel? I said, I feel great. I don't hurt no more, nothing. And he says, do you want to go back? And I go, no. And he goes, why? And I go, because everything's peaceful up here. It's perfect. I love it up here. And he goes, well, you have a purpose in life, and when you fulfill it, you can come back and visit me again someday. And then poof, I was back in my body. I was 9 months old. When I was little, like back in the third grade, my third grade teacher asked us to write in a journal. We used to just write in a journal every week about something that happened in our life. And one day it was something that real that happened in our life. And I wrote a big long story about what happened to me and my death experience. And I turned it in, and the teacher told me, oh, this is a really great story, but next time tell the truth and make something real that happened. That kind of crushed me from there, and I really did think I was different. I went around through junior high and high school like the weird person. People made fun of me. Nobody ever believed me. My friends just, I had very few friends, like 3 or 4 friends, and they just believed me to be my friends. And that was really it. So I guess I kind of did feel like I was different in a way, but now I don't. Something that it can't happen to very many people. I feel kind of like an important person now in life. Like, I guess somebody like Moses, I guess you could say.
Now let me tell you about 2 people who were transformed after attempting suicide. Kimberly is a happily married 47-year-old woman who is quick to say she is glad to be alive. She seems so happy to me now that it is hard to believe that as a child she almost succeeded in killing herself. She was raised in Washington, D.C. by parents who were so abusive that she is still unable to discuss the specifics of her childhood. How she attempted to commit suicide makes me believe that life for her was indeed horrific. At the age of 7, she towed her sled to the top of a very steep hill and aimed it at a cement bench by the street. Her plan was to slide head first into the bench. Without hesitating, she lay down and took what was to be her last ride. She successfully hit the bench and immediately found herself floating above her body. She saw children surrounding her, but no one went for help. This heartless reaction didn't surprise her because she lived in a tough inner-city neighborhood. She floated higher and higher to the rooftops of the buildings where she had never been before. She also saw that the apartments had fake Tudor fronts. Things then changed. I went up and up, she says, and faded into a deep silver-blue surrounding. Then came something that looked like a big umbrella without a stick. This umbrella seemed to fold around me, and everything became very dark. Then suddenly I was in a very intense bright light. I felt warm and loved in a way that I had never felt before. I heard a voice from the light say, "You have made a mistake. Your life is not yours to take. You must go back." I argued with the voice. "No one cares about me," I said. The answer I got back was shocking. "You're right," the voice said. "No one on this planet cares about you, including your parents. It is your job to care for yourself." Kimberly was suddenly returned to her body, which at this point wasn't a pleasant place to be. She was in intense pain. Her mouth had been embedded on a wooden railing around the bench. Her neck was broken. She tried to move her head and lost many of her teeth and a piece of her tongue. Kimberly remembers thinking that as soon as she could, she would go back to the top of the snowy hill and try to kill herself again. As soon as that thought came to mind, Kimberly was engulfed by the umbrella and taken out of her body again. Warm in this bubble of love and light, as she called it, she was treated to an awesome vision. The warm bubble melted the snow and ice from a nearby tree on which she often played. The bubble showed her that although the tree was encased in snow and ice now, it would have green leaves on it in the summertime. She saw herself sitting beneath the tree, eating a sweet apple from its branches and feeling pleasure and joy. Suddenly, she understood what was being shown to her. I saw that the winter tree and the summer tree were two parts of a whole, she said. When I realized that summer was ahead, I was willing to go back into my body. The experience transformed her. She began to speak up for her rights and became a self-advocate instead of a dispirited victim of child abuse. Kimberly has spent her life establishing a family of love, the type that she never had herself. She is happily married with 3 children. She wears an umbrella on a charm necklace to always remember what the experience taught her. Here is the second story. At the age of 11, James swallowed handfuls of Darvon, codeine, Tylenol, and aspirin, and walked into a wooded park to die. Fortunately, a couple of young lovers followed his path about an hour later and found his comatose body. They called an ambulance. James was rescued with almost no time to spare. When he was revived, he told of an experience of light. 20 years later, he told me about it. Everything went dark when I died, he said, just as I thought it would. Then suddenly my world was filled with light. It seemed to fill in all the dark spots in my life, namely those feelings of emptiness that I had from being an abused child. A spirit in the light asked me why I tried to kill myself. So I told him about how bad my life and world were. He was kind, but not very sympathetic. He said, "Well, you'll just have to stick around and see what you can do with your life." James has done wonderful things with his life. Although his conversation with the light made him think he was insane for years afterward, he now realizes that he gained new purpose through his experience. At the age of 25, James works in the nation's only summer camp for children with AIDS. He now considers himself lucky. He says, "My near-death experience taught me that I had to create my own possibilities. I would never have found that out on my own." I feel honored to have heard these transformative near-death experiences from 2 survivors of childhood suicide attempts. Childhood suicide is rare and usually predicts a lifetime of mental instability. Yet here are 2 successful adults who have conquered their childhood traumas and now live extraordinary lives. Experiencing the light has given people new purpose in life. By that, I don't mean that they were saved by God to invent a cure for cancer or save the world from nuclear destruction. Nothing that grandiose. Their purpose is quite simple and can be easily summed up. Revere life and see the intricate connections throughout the universe. Even many years after their NDEs, these special people believe that the light gave them power to transform their lives. In many ways, they have become so transformed that they have given up some involvement with their own egos. This process has enabled some to become much more sensitive to others. One woman, for instance, told me that her near-death experience gave her the power to read minds. By that, she didn't mean that she could read them, like reading a book. "I have just become more intuitive," she said, "and can understand how others think. This has helped me in my job as a nurse." Many children and adults have said that NDEs make them more sensitive to people around them. The message given to these children of the light is not new or controversial. It is as old as mankind itself and has served as the primary fuel for our great religions. Messages like this: love your neighbor and cherish life. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Clean up your own mess. Be the best that you can be. Contribute to society. Be nice, be kind, and loving. These messages have a special urgency for those who have had near-death experiences. Why? Perhaps since the messages came to them at the point of death, they must be important. After 8 years of scientific research into near-death experiences in children, I decided to re-interview the original group of patients from the Seattle study. When I first spoke to them, they had never before shared their entire experience. Back then, they were shy and sometimes reluctant to talk about floating on air or about a man who glowed like a light bulb. Sometimes the only way I could get them to speak about their NDEs would be to hand them paper and crayons and let them draw a picture of it. Now, almost 10 years later, I wondered what these kids would be like. Had they adjusted well with their peers? Were they doing well in school? Did they have a perspective on the world that differed from their friends? Or did their profound spiritual experience make no difference at all? I found that these children have become special teenagers who have excellent relationships with their families. They share a maturity and wisdom that is humbling. This group from the Seattle study displays a conspicuous absence of drug abuse and even experimentation. They were selected for the study because they had survived cardiac arrest. Yet instead of the brain damage and retardation that usually result from such a traumatic event, they had good grades and fine behavior. I spoke to each and every child from the original study and found these traits in all of them. Here is some of what I discovered when I visited these special kids. For instance, patient 1 in my study is now 20 years old and vividly remembers his experience. He left his body when his heart stopped and watched as physicians worked frantically to save him. His experience had been impressive to me because of the wealth of detail he was able to remember from his own resuscitation. His description was so authentic that it is hard to explain unless he was actually on the ceiling watching his own resuscitation. The experience has had a deep effect upon the way he thinks and lives. He describes himself as being more serious than most kids his age, but also a lot happier. His philosophy of life is simple and serene. He has a vision of what he wants to do and is working hard to achieve it. He wants to get married and have a family, and he wants to work in a trade that he can count on for work. He ended our conversation with virtually the identical words of so many other children of the light. I know one thing, he said. I am not afraid to die. My near-death experience has made me much more aware of life. It has kept me from being interested in drugs or driving around in cars and getting high like my friends do. Dina was an 8-year-old who nearly died of a diabetic coma. She left her body and was able to identify accurately many details of her resuscitation. Then she saw a box in front of her with a red and green button. Behind her stood tall beings in white that she later called doctors. Although they coaxed her to push the red button, she chose the green instead and returned to her body. Although she called these beings doctors, they glowed from an inner light and had the same characteristics that other children describe as angels. Dina also had to make a decision about crossing a barrier, which in her case was choosing the correct button. How did this near-death experience affect Dina? She says that it caused her to see life differently than most people. Little things that bother others don't really bother me, she says. I feel calmer and more in control. Dina sees her NDE as a special happening. She has a deep belief in God, but does not attend church on a regular basis. Dina's mother calls her serene and very mature for her age. And, as with the others in the study, Dina doesn't fear death, but wants to make sure that she lives life to the fullest. Bill, another patient in the original study, has now had a second near-death experience as a result of his chronic kidney problems. Bill's near-death experiences helped to put his life into perspective. Once the rebel of the family, Bill has now embraced his family's faith in Christ, becoming a devout Christian. His transformation has helped his family deal with the incredible strain of raising children with kidney problems. Bill's younger brother died of kidney failure, and to stay alive, he and his sister spend 12 to 18 hours a week attached to a home dialysis machine. The divorce rate in such situations is well over 75%. Yet this family, for all intents and purposes, leads a fairly normal life. Have Bill's near-death experiences helped them achieve that normalcy? Bill said, "These things have helped me gain comfort through God. Can't you feel it? The Spirit is everywhere in this house." I have to admit I did feel a rare spirit of family and a joy with these fine people. These children have grown up to become remarkable teenagers. Not rocket scientists, not high priests in robes, just positive and upbeat kids with a joy that is inspiring. They have not become involved with drugs or alcohol. They have not gotten pregnant. And they rarely, according to their parents, get out of line. Their actions speak louder than words about the reality of the near-death experience. And how has a decade of near-death research affected me and the way I approach medicine? It has changed everything in my life, including my views on medicine, the way I see society, and even the way I deal with my family. When I began my studies, 10 years ago, I was in mainstream medicine. I laughingly referred to myself as a rodent brain surgeon who researched the effects of radiation therapy on a child's brain. I undertook near-death studies as a sideline to an already busy schedule. I was fascinated by the subject, but always felt that we would demonstrate that a particular drug or disease process was responsible for this phenomenon. When I accepted Dr. Raymond Moody's challenge to study NDEs scientifically, I felt certain that science would explain them. All these years later, I accept what the ancients knew. All men must die, and death is not to be feared. There is a light that we will all experience after death, and that light represents joy, peace, and unconditional love. These children have taught me that we each have the ability to experience the light, and that the light teaches us that we are each important in our own way. Our research brought together new and pre-existing information that revealed a genetically imprinted circuit in the brain that can generate the near-death experience. The existence of that area has caused me to include the concept of the soul in my medical thinking. Why? The simplest, most logical way to explain our current knowledge of man's consciousness is the hypothesis that there actually is a soul within each of us, independent of brain tissue. I have documented that we have an area in the brain, the right temporal lobe, that some researchers describe as the seat of the soul. It is connected to the hippocampus, which serves as the brain's master control, sorting out thousands of pieces of sensory input and deciding which of them should be acted upon. It contains our unconscious desires and our ability to dream. Without this area, we would be like robots, unable to initiate purposeful activity and not caring about the passage of time. The hippocampus has been called the man in the machine by some neurologists. It is directly connected to areas in the right temporal and occipital lobes that contain the neuronal circuitry to create near-death experiences. The sensation of leaving the body, seeing dead relatives, hearing heavenly music, speaking with God, and reviewing one's own life are part of our genetic makeup, hardwired into each of us. The near-death experience is the first psychological experience to be located within the brain. Others soon will follow. By locating the area for NDEs within the brain, we have anatomy to back up the psychological experience. We know where the circuit board is. Now neurologists can accept the spirituality of the near-death experience because we know where they are generated within our brains. Near-death experiences are an example of a psychological experience that can be anatomically located within the brain. The real value of my research team's results is that we have established that the near-death experience is a natural and normal event that happens to human beings when they die. My research team has documented the transformative power of NDEs and the people who have them. These transformations are healthy ones, emphasizing a joy and devotion to life. One person told me that her experience taught her that grief is growth. Another person learned that everything in the world is interconnected, and that whatever problems one faces, there is a reason for that problem. The knowledge that a loving bright light awaits us all at the point of death seems to generate an excitement and dedication to living life to its fullest before joining that light. Psychologist Carl Jung felt that therapy and psychoanalysis rarely change one's life. Changes only occur, said Jung, through experiences such as a mystical conversion. Near-death experiences certainly represent such a conversion. Their ability to transform should not be ignored. Because of their mystical qualities, NDEs are often dismissed by physicians who feel a need to quantify everything. Research into the transformative qualities of the near-death experience could have a tremendous impact on our healthcare system. Perhaps a joint effort by neurochemists and psychiatrists could be initiated to learn other ways of accessing this area of the brain. Many of our health problems have roots in the mind, such as alcoholism, drug addiction, and obesity. Alcoholism is virtually untreatable by medication, psychiatry, or behavioral control. Imagine if the transformative reaction to NDEs could be available to anyone who wants the power to change his life for the better. Another possibility for near-death research would be through blood analysis. Since we know that a large number of people having cardiac arrest will have near-death experiences, why not draw some extra blood from them for analysis? These patients have a considerable amount of blood drawn anyway. It would be easy and ethical to draw an extra tube to analyze for evidence of which neurochemicals might be involved in triggering NDEs. We could, for example, examine this blood for elevated levels of serotonin and endorphins. This information could then be used to design new drugs that could activate the areas of the brain responsible for this transformation. Such an experiment would be a joint effort between psychiatrists, who could collect and quantify the clinical data, neurologists, who could identify specific areas of brain function, and neurochemists, who could design ways of biochemically marking neurochemical activity. Another research project could utilize specialized EEGs to document the activity of the hippocampus. The brain waves of persons who have near-death experiences could be compared with people who report ecstatic states and out-of-body experiences through meditation in order to see if there are any similarities. In a more basic realm, few studies currently exist in the medical literature to document the psychological effects of simply discussing death and dying with terminal patients and their families. Isn't that a shocking commentary on how far we have fallen from the time-honored deathbed scene in which the dying person was in control? Now, not only are most dying patients completely dependent on physicians and nurses for their every need, but we have them in a position of psychological dependence as well. By discussing pre-death visions, near-death experiences, and death itself with dying patients and their families, we can take grief out of isolation and stop ignoring this difficult yet inevitable event. By discussing the dying process, we will learn to heal ourselves. Families will learn from the grieving process, and physicians and nurses will prevent the burnout of working with the dying. This is strictly my opinion. No data exists to support or deny that opinion. Many other research opportunities exist, all of them valuable in advancing medicine. Let me list a few of them. 1. We need to survey the attitudes that nurses and physicians have about life and death. Knowing these belief systems would help us understand how the attitudes of the caregivers can influence what the patients are willing to share with them. 2. Do the pre-death visions or near-death experiences of a dying patient help the surviving spouses or parents deal with their grief? These events may offer valuable opportunities to resolve grief that are currently being ignored. 3. It is well known that widows and widowers often die within 1 year of the death of their spouse. Would aggressive intervention with a discussion of near-death experiences decrease this mortality rate? One family told me that when their son died, a minister told them, "Your son is all right. He is in heaven now. I know, because I have been there myself." He then told them of his own near-death experience. It proved to be a great relief to the family. 4. Does this type of counseling help or hurt those who are grieving? No studies currently exist to let us know. 5. Do open discussions of pre-death visions help to prevent physician and nurse burnout in intensive care units and on wards with high mortality rates? Studies need to be done to find the answers to other questions. Does counseling about near-death experiences in terminally ill patients in hospitals or in hospices create a better environment for them? Do they require as many drugs? Does helping patients die in control and with dignity, including a deathbed scene in which they are coherent and not heavily sedated, heal the grief of surviving family members? Are there ways to encourage patients to have pre-death visions? For instance, can hypnosis help the patient to have a therapeutic pre-death vision? Dr. G.G. Gardner, a psychologist at the University of Colorado Children's Hospital, actually accomplished this with a patient she calls David. This 13-year-old boy was dying of leukemia. When it became clear that David had only a few months to live, Dr. Gardner asked him to think of an image or symbol that could help him deal with the anxiety of death. David chose an eagle, which could soar through the air, away from his pain-filled body to a place of peace and love. His family used this image to prepare him for death. In the final days of his life, his father would whisper, "Soar, David. Go to that special place." He died in his father's arms, flying from his pain one last time. David's image of the soaring eagle was an archetype that arose from his unconscious during hypnosis. The types of pre-death visions I presented earlier have been of a very different nature. They are visions of heaven or spirit guides that arise spontaneously, not out of guided meditations. I predict that any person who is willing to listen to a dying patient will hear that patient speak of a vision that has the power to heal. They may speak of an eagle soaring to a private and secure place. They may speak of a land of déjà vu where they can experience the pleasures of sex, as one of my teenage patients did. Or they may speak of a rocket ship which is taking them to the moon. These visions are real to the person having them and shouldn't be treated as examples of disorientation or confusion. Words like these lead physicians to medicate the visions right out of a dying patient. Can education and counseling about near-death experiences reverse this pattern and give the dying patient support when they most need it? Maybe. Let's study the question and find out. There is one important lesson I have learned from a decade of near-death studies. Listen. Be compassionate. And understand that people, including children, have a need to feel in control. Once we physicians start listening to patients and respecting and sharing with them, they will give us extra tools to help in the healing process. Let me give you an example of another healing vision from my own practice. Upon learning of my interest in near-death experiences, a patient shared with me a vision she had about her son who died at age 10. When he was 6 months old, she found out that he had cerebral palsy. She was informed of this diagnosis in a horrible way. After an extensive series of tests in a large city hospital, a nurse approached her and said, "Has anyone told you yet?" She replied, "No, what do you mean?" The nurse simply handed her a piece of paper with cerebral palsy written on it. She was distraught. She had received no counseling, no compassionate shoulder to cry on, just the word cerebral palsy written on a piece of paper. That night, she saw a vision of her son at the age of 10. He was smiling, beautiful, and healthy, and seemed to be saying to her, "Look, Mom, I'm all right." She clung to the memory of that vision throughout her life. Although he could not eat, speak, sit up, or walk, she continued to see him as happy and well as he had appeared that one mystical night. At the age of 10, he died in his sleep. It was then that she realized the meaning of her vision. He was free of a body crippled by cerebral palsy. She didn't come to me asking if I believed in life after death, or if I thought her son was happy now. The vision had answered both of those questions for her. All she needed was comfort and assurance that what happened was meant to be. After 10 years of listening to the near-death experiences of children, I realized that science, as great as it is, tells only half the story about life beyond and the human soul. The children of the light tell the rest. Listen to what they have told me. I have a wonderful secret to tell you. I have been climbing a staircase to heaven. I just wanted to get to that light. Forget my body, forget everything. I just wanted to get to that light. There were a lot of good things in that light. I was told that life is painful and that I had to go back anyway. I heard a voice say, "Go back, Bobby, you have a job to do." There was a beautiful light that had everything good in it. For about a week, I could see sparkles of that light in everything. Before falling asleep at night, I could see that light. I wasn't afraid to live again because I knew that someday I would be with that light. When you hurt yourself, everything is hurt. You'll see, heaven is fun.